Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Dan Gorodnick, Chair of the City Planning Commission and Director of the Department of City Planning. Welcome to today's review session of the City Planning Commission. Today's date is April 29, 2024. We are joined today by Commissioners Benjamin, Cerullo, Kermani, Marin, Osorio, Rampershad, and I expect we will see others before long. Before we get to today's agenda, I would like to mention that last week, the Department of City Planning released its latest housing production numbers, which the public can explore through new interactive online tools on the Department of City Planning's website. These numbers put our city's ongoing housing shortage in stark relief. For example, in 2023, only 16,359 new homes were permitted, the lowest figure since 2016, and a clear indication that the expiration of the 421A tax incentive program has depressed new housing production. Meanwhile, the distribution of housing that is built continues to be extremely uneven. In 2023, 10 community districts saw as much new housing as the other 49. 10, as much as the other 49. A pattern that locks New Yorkers out of housing opportunity in large swaths of the city while concentrating new development in select areas. And across the city, 10 neighborhoods actually lost housing last year. 10 neighborhoods lost housing. Now, I'm very glad that the state budget includes a new tax incentive for multifamily rental construction to replace 421A. This will play a critical role in spurring new housing production, as will other state tools to encourage office conversions and raise the FAR cap for residential construction. While these measures will help, tackling our housing shortage also requires bold action here at the city level. And this brings us to our agenda today. We'll begin with the referral of City of Yes for Housing Opportunity, the most pro-housing set of zoning changes ever proposed in New York City. Over the past 60 years, we have created more and more complicated and restrictive zoning rules that are holding back the housing that we need. The impact of these stymieing rules has been significant. Over the past 4 decades, New York City built fewer homes than the 40 years before that, even though our population was growing when it had been shrinking in the prior 40 years. In the last decade, we added 800,000 new jobs and just 200,000 new homes. And the housing that were built, as noted before, is concentrated in only a few neighborhoods. It's clear that we must build much more housing. Our housing shortage is at the root of so many of our city's challenges. The high cost of rent, gentrification, displacement, homelessness. Companies can't hire employees because of the cost of housing. The imbalance of power between landlords and tenants. With a 1.4% vacancy rate, there is a stark imbalance of power between landlords and tenants. And New Yorkers are feeling this housing shortage every single day. Growing families can't find a new place to live. Working New Yorkers face crushing commutes. Home ownership feels increasingly out of reach to many. Aging New Yorkers can't downsize or stay close to their families. But we don't need to live this way. Cities across the country are showing that when you build more housing, rents come down. Tenants have choices. Government policies have restricted our housing, and changing our zoning can help us build more housing. And that's exactly what City of Yes for Housing Opportunity will do. This initiative has a simple premise: build a little more housing in every neighborhood. Mayor Adams has been crystal clear that every community and every neighborhood must be a part of the solution to our housing crisis. City Council Speaker Adrienne Adams has been a great leader on this as well, passing the Fair Housing Framework at the City Council. We're going to hear more from the team in a moment on what exactly City of Yes for Housing Opportunity would do. But it is clear that it is a critical initiative for the future of New York City. With this approach, we can make a big overall impact on the housing shortage without dramatic changes in any one neighborhood. This proposal can set New York City on a path toward a more affordable future with more housing choices and would benefit New Yorkers for decades to come. I'd like to thank everyone who joined Mayor Adams and the Department of City Planning this morning at our rally for this important initiative, including housing advocates and builders, labor and business leaders, our faith community, policy experts, and everyday working New Yorkers from across the city. I also want to give a shout out to all of the Department of City Planning staff across the agency who have gotten us to this point, including Community Planning and Civic Engagement, Environmental Assessment and Review Division, Pipeline and Commission Operations, Strategic Planning, Technical Review, Zoning, Communications, Intergovernmental Affairs, and I'm giving you the names of the divisions, but behind each of these divisions are lots of people who have worked really, really hard to get us today. And of course, most of all, our housing division, led by the brilliant, tireless team of John Mangin, Veronica Brown, and Winnie Shen. We look forward to hearing your presentation in just a few minutes. Now, City of Yes is not the only proposal before us today. We will also learn about an application by Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center to facilitate a new hospital building with a pedestrian bridge over 67th Street within their existing campus at 1233 York Avenue in Lenox Hill. Staying in Manhattan, we'll next learn about a modification to the unit size mix for a senior affordable housing building at 570 Washington Street in Hudson Square. They're proposing a shift from mostly one-bedrooms and studios to a blend of two-bedroom, one-bedroom, and studio units. So it's a busy day here at the City Planning Commission. Thank you all very much for being here. And with that, Sarah, I'm going to turn to you and let's get started.
Good afternoon and welcome to the City Planning Commission Review Session for Monday, April 29, 2024. The time is 1:09 p.m. and a quorum is present. The first item on our agenda is a non-ULIP referral of a citywide zoning text amendment. Presenting for the first time to the Commission are Veronica Brown and Winnie Chen.
Welcome, Veronica and Winnie. For our first time, this is a biggie, so congratulations. We're excited and thank you for all of your work today.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Winnie Shen. I'm a planner of our Housing Division, and I'm joined by my colleague, Veronica Brown, also a planner in our Housing Division. So we're excited for you to hear about City Yes for Housing Opportunity, a citywide text amendment that would change zoning to allow for equitable housing development. These changes will enable a little more housing in every neighborhood by removing barriers to housing growth. City of Yes for Housing Opportunity is a citywide plan that would encourage incremental housing growth over a wide geography. New York City faces a severe housing shortage. The vacancy rate for rental apartments is historically low, only 1.4%, far below a healthy vacancy rate that would provide New Yorkers with housing options. Because our housing demand is greater than our housing supply, New Yorkers are experiencing very high housing costs. Over half of New York City renters are rent burdened, meaning they spend over 30% of their monthly income on rent. Not having enough homes is also a direct cause of homelessness. On a given night in December of 2023, there were over 92,800 homeless New Yorkers, including 33,350 children, sleeping in the shelter system every night. Most of New York City's housing was created in the first half of the 20th century. Since that time, housing production has fallen dramatically. That's in part because of zoning that has become increasingly restrictive since 1961. While housing production has decreased, demand for housing has increased. There are a number of reasons for this. For example, households are smaller today than they used to be, meaning even the same amount of people take up more space. What recent housing production has occurred has been limited to only a few neighborhoods. In 2023, 10 community districts produce as much housing as the other 49. When some neighborhoods stop producing housing, that puts additional pressure on the other neighborhoods to produce more and more housing. The proposals in City Yes for Housing Opportunity emerge from the goals outlined in Where We Live NYC, the city's fair housing plan. Where We Live NYC was created by Housing Preservation Development, HPD, in collaboration with over 250 community organizations. It highlights how the city's housing shortage and affordability crisis have severely limited New Yorkers' housing choices. In a tight housing market, landlords can charge high rents, and existing tenants are vulnerable to tenant harassment, poor housing quality, and displacement pressure as they compete with each other for a limited number of homes. When there are few apartments to choose from, renters pay more. These conditions further worsen the neighborhood-based legacies of segregation, discrimination, and concentrated poverty that have led to the deeply unequal city we have today, where neighborhoods have unequal access to resources and opportunities. The average New York City household makes about $70,000 a year, but the average two-bedroom apartment in New York City is over $2,700. This means that your average working family would have to spend about half of their income on rent to get a home for their family. New York City's dire housing shortage has direct human consequences. These have been underscored in our extended community engagement process. Over the past year, DCP has met with over 100 groups, including housing nonprofits, tenants' rights groups, faith-based organizations, and affordable housing providers. Each of these groups was able to share a unique and valuable perspective on the lived experiences resulting from our housing crisis. When New York City fails to produce housing, all New Yorkers feel the economic consequences. Wage gains go to higher rents, and businesses can't expand because workers can't afford housing. Allowing New York to build more housing can also help to create good quality jobs in construction and residential maintenance, adding an estimated $58.2 billion to the city's economy and creating 260,000 jobs. Many city agencies work on policies and programs that aim to address New Yorkers' housing needs. The Department of City Planning is responsible for the city's zoning. Zoning regulates what can be built on a particular site, both how big the building can be and what uses it can have, residential or commercial, for example. Sometimes zoning includes other things like requirements for income-restricted affordable housing. But zoning does not fund new housing or directly control what will be built. It only establishes rules for what may be built. How much housing gets built depends on many factors. Other tools the city uses to support good housing outcomes include subsidies or tax incentives to promote income-restricted affordable housing, programs for affordable home ownership, and tenant protections that guarantee New Yorkers' rights. Changing our zoning can respond to these housing issues by increasing the number and the types of homes available in every neighborhood across the city. If each neighborhood adds a little more housing, New York City can add a lot more housing overall without any single neighborhood experiencing dramatic changes or overwhelmed infrastructure. This text amendment is the biggest pro-housing change DCP has ever undertaken and would touch the zoning for every single part of the city. The Universal Affordability Preference, or UAP, which would allow bigger buildings for affordable housing in every medium high-density zone district. And across the city, the proposal will remove residential parking mandates, which are making housing more expensive. The proposal will also create more missing middle housing or low-rise apartment buildings in our low-density areas. The proposal also aims to help homeowners in our low-density neighborhoods by allowing them to add accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, to their homes, and providing small buildings with additional flexibility to adapt over time. There are also a range of smaller proposals, including enabling conversions of non-residential buildings, allowing more small and shared apartments, and allowing for residential campuses to add height-limited buildings.
Exclusionary zoning rules have made it virtually impossible to build housing in many low-density neighborhoods. This places additional pressure on the high-density parts of New York City to produce more housing. This wasn't always the case. Small apartment buildings and 2 to 3 family buildings are common in New York City's low-density neighborhoods, and were allowed in many places until as recently as the 1990s and early 2000s, when stricter zoning prevented them. City of Yes for Housing Opportunity would reintroduce modest buildings that are more naturally affordable than other types of construction, and apartment buildings at a scale in which they could take advantage of existing affordability programs. Together, these changes would allow for the creation of more housing in low-density areas without affecting neighborhood character. Our town center proposal aims to create more missing middle housing in low-density areas. Missing middle refers to a category of housing that's modest in scale and often affordable to middle-income residents, the once common type of housing that's not often built in the city anymore. This proposal aims to re-legalize mixed-use apartments, or buildings with a ground floor commercial use and a few stories of housing on top. This is a classic New York City building type that exists along many low-density commercial corridors. Overly complex zoning rules now make it almost impossible to build new ones. This proposal would streamline those zoning rules, including restrictive limits on floor area and height, so that it's once again feasible to build 2 to 4 stories of housing above a commercial ground floor. Our second proposal for missing middle housing is transit-oriented development. Transit-oriented development would allow for low-rise apartment buildings, 3 to 5 stories, depending on the underlying zoning, on sites that are near transit where they meet specific criteria. So first, the site must be on a block within 0.5 miles of subway or rail station. Second, the lot must be over 5,000 square feet. And finally, the lot must be located on the short end of the block or on a wide street, which zoning defines as being over 75 feet wide. Community facilities like faith-based organizations or libraries could also use these rules throughout the city on sites over 5,000 square feet if a community facility space is present. Our transit-oriented development rules would promote missing middle housing while also promoting sustainability by adding housing in areas with good transit access. In the rest of our low-density areas, the proposal aims to give homeowners more flexibility. Under this proposal, a single or two-family home would be allowed to add a small accessory dwelling unit, or an ADU. There are a range of types of ADUs. These include backyard cottages, garage conversions, and basement apartments. These small units could provide important housing options for small households, like a young person moving into their own place for the first time, or an elderly resident who wants to age in place. Because of their small size, they also serve different income levels than a large single-family home. Successful ADU programs across the country show us that these units can give multi-generational families a little more space and help middle-class homeowners manage their household expenses. Only a very small percentage of eligible lots in these other locations chose to add an ADU, about 1% per year. But this incremental housing growth has big benefits for homeowners and tenants. The proposal also includes rules to ensure that ADUs are safe. New basement ADUs would not be allowed in the coastal floodplain, and no ADUs would be allowed in the special coastal risk districts, which are the areas of our city that have the most severe flood risk. Outside of these coastal areas, basement ADUs may be subject to additional regulations or review. The same rule changes that would enable ADUs could also help a homeowner who doesn't want to add an ADU, but just needs more flexibility to adapt or renovate their home to meet their family's needs. Our research shows us that many existing buildings are out of compliance, meaning they're not in line with today's zoning rules. So for example, R41 districts are two-family districts that allow semi-detached buildings like what you see in this photo. But buildings like these pre-1961 duplexes couldn't be built today because they have more square footage than what is currently allowed and their rear yards are too small. These non-compliances end up causing big headaches for homeowners if they need to borrow money from the bank or if they want to make simple changes to their home, like renovating an outdated kitchen. The proposal would fix these rules, which would have dual benefits. So first, homeowners of existing buildings won't run into these issues when they go to make an alteration to their building, because the zoning would better match what's actually on the ground. But second, you'd actually be able to build a two-family home in a two-family district or a multifamily home in a multifamily district, when today, the only thing that might be feasible is a single-family home.
Next, we're going to turn our attention to the medium high-density areas of New York City, where our focus is creating more opportunities for housing, including affordable housing. To do this, the proposal introduces the Universal Affordability Preference, or UAP. It allows apartment buildings to be at least 20% larger, so long as the extra space is occupied by permanently affordable or supportive housing. UAP is modeled after current rules that allow bigger buildings for affordable senior housing in some neighborhoods. UAP will allow for incremental housing growth in neighborhoods and encourage affordable housing throughout the city, rather than concentrating it in a few neighborhoods. This map shows which districts have an existing senior housing preference today, shown in the light orange. Through the UAP framework, all forms of affordable and supportive housing would be able to take advantage of the higher FARs already provided to affordable senior housing in these districts. However, there are a few districts that don't have the senior housing preference today, shown in dark orange on the map. In these areas, the proposal would create new FARs to enable the growth of affordable and supportive housing in every neighborhood. The proposal would also make sure that zoning provides room to build the extra affordable housing required through universal affordability preference. There would be limited height increases where it is necessary to make enough room for these affordable homes. So what does affordability mean for UAP? UAP would have an affordability requirement of 60% area median income. Area median income, or AMI, is a measure of affordability established by the federal government. At 60% AMI, or $76,260 for a family of 3, UAP would serve lower income New Yorkers than the existing zoning tool called voluntary inclusionary housing, or VIH. UAP would replace the voluntary inclusionary housing program with the mandatory inclusionary housing, MIH, which requires a percentage of new developments to be income-restricted affordable housing, will continue to exist and be mapped when there are significant increases in residential density. UAP would also serve New Yorkers at even lower income levels through income averaging. Income averaging means that instead of only including homes at the required affordability level, a building can include homes at a range of incomes that average the required affordability. So for example, a building can meet UAP's 60% AMI affordability level by including a mix of homes at 30% AMI, or roughly $38,000 for a family of 3, 60% AMI, about $76,000 for a family of 3, and 90% AMI, over $114,000 for a family of 3. Through UAP's deeper affordability requirement and the introduction of income averaging, UAP can help to serve the low-income New Yorkers who most need affordable housing. Here is one example of how universal affordability preference works. If a church located in an R6 district wants to build affordable housing today, they get 3.0 FAR, regardless of whether developing market rate or affordable housing. This will allow them to build about 35 units. Under UAP, they get 3.9 FAR, but the additional 0.9 FAR could only be used for affordable housing. If it is, they can build about 10 to 12 more affordable apartments. Now, 10 to 12 more affordable apartments may not sound like a lot, but this is functioning at a citywide scale. If every project has a few more affordable homes, New York City can add a significant amount of affordable housing, and no single neighborhood will experience drastic changes. This is a rendering of how UAP would play out. Without UAP, the building is built according to the base FAR for market rate housing. The result is this 8-story apartment building. With UAP, the building can be about 20% bigger, which for this example translates to an additional 2 stories, so long as the extra space is permanently affordable housing. UAP can make a big impact on our housing crisis. In our initial calculations, we found that had UAP been in place since 2014, with tax incentives and public subsidies fully in support, an additional 20,000 income-restricted affordable homes could have been created and house 50,000 New Yorkers. Mandatory inclusionary housing, MIH areas would remain in place and continue to be mapped when there are significant increases in residential density. Because establishing MIH requires a rezoning, it is only applicable in limited parts of the city. UAP would extend an inclusionary framework across all medium and high-density areas at once. This proposal would also introduce some improvements to MIH. First, under this proposal, MIH Option 3, previously known as a deep affordability option, could be applied as a standalone option. Today, it has to be applied as an alternate with MIH Options 1 or 2. This would allow future actions to ensure deep affordability when MIH is applied. Some MIH FARs would be raised to meet UAP FARs. For example, R6A currently has an MIH FAR of 3.6, which would be raised to 3.9. The options will remain in place, meaning the same percentage of affordability will continue to be required. Finally, the current MIH program is incompatible with tools that facilitate affordable home ownership. This proposal would exempt 100% affordable home ownership projects from rules that prevent them from penciling out.
Now I'm going to present a series of proposals that apply citywide. So first, I'll present our parking proposal. This proposal would make parking optional for new housing everywhere, following the example of many other major cities. Today, New York City requires new housing to include off-street parking, even where it's not needed. These mandates mean less space for housing and increased construction costs, which results in less housing being built. The diagram on this slide represents that parking can take up a lot of space. 2 parking spaces is roughly equivalent to the size of a studio apartment. Building parking is also expensive, and that's an obstacle to housing growth, especially affordable housing. This proposal would prioritize housing over parking. Parking would still be allowed, and we anticipate the developers will respond to market needs and continue to provide parking in the areas where there's a demand for it. But removing parking mandates can help reduce the cost of housing construction and enable the development of more homes in each new building. This example shows how lifting parking mandates can support housing growth. A developer sees this underutilized lot that's in a great location, right near transit, and they want to build an apartment building. The lot could realistically accommodate 16 homes, but today the developer stops at just 10 homes so they can waive out of parking requirements. As soon as they add that 11th unit, they would need to provide 6 parking spaces. By eliminating parking mandates, the developer can fully build out the lot to include those 6 additional apartments. 6 additional apartments might not seem significant, but when hundreds of sites across the city are able to build more housing, that incremental change results in a lot more housing available for New Yorkers. City of Yes for housing opportunity would also make it easier for underused non-residential buildings, including offices, to convert into housing. To do this, the proposal would make a few changes to our adaptive reuse regulations. First, the proposal would expand these regulations citywide to go beyond office districts. That way, a broader range of underused buildings, including vacant schools or former religious buildings, can be converted into housing. Second, the proposal would move the eligibility cutoff date from 1961 or 1977 up to 1991. This allows more recently constructed buildings to convert into housing. And third, the proposal would enable the conversion to all types of housing, including supportive housing, shared housing, and dorms. Our next proposal would allow more small apartments in central locations by making it possible to build a building with only studio and 1-bedroom apartments. Today, we force many people into living situations that they don't want. In some cases, that's a shelter or doubling up in an overcrowded unit. But our lack of housing options is also what forces young professionals to team up with roommates and occupy family-sized units. Allowing more small apartments could help to ease the pressure on these large units. Allowing buildings with more small apartments would involve changes to the dwelling unit factor, a measure of the minimum average unit size in a building. This zoning rule requires buildings to have a mix of big and small units if they want to max out their space. The dwelling unit factor is outdated and redundant with other codes that do a better job regulating the minimum unit size. Under this proposal, the dwelling unit factor would be removed in the areas of the city that have the best proximity to transit, what's known as the transit zone, and is shown in the darker green color on the map. Buildings would still be subject to rules like the Housing Maintenance Code and the Building Code, which set minimum sizes for livable rooms and require windows and other measures for safety and livability. Income-restricted housing would still be subject to existing HPD rules about bedroom mixes. Outside of this central area, the zoning regulations would be reduced and simplified so that all multifamily buildings have a dwelling unit factor of 500. Currently, arbitrary dwelling unit factors vary by zoning district. These changes could re-legalize an important housing type while easing the pressure on family-sized units. This proposal would also develop clear rules for building shared housing, or homes with private bedrooms but shared kitchens and other common facilities. Our current zoning does not have a clear path for building shared housing. Creating clear definitions and rules would make this process less complex and enable a fuller range of shared housing options. These rules would make it possible to build shared housing in any multifamily zoning district. This would enable the development of new construction shared housing, including affordable shared housing. These clear rules can also help to legalize existing unregulated shared housing. Other cities, like Seattle and San Diego, have already re-legalized this type of housing and found that it meets a need in their housing market. New York City can learn from these examples, as well as the city's own history, to see the importance of re-legalizing small and shared options. HPD will also pursue changes to other rules, including the Housing Maintenance Code, to make shared housing feasible. This proposal would also make it easier to add contextual infill to campuses and other irregular or challenged sites. Previous campus development often took place under tower-in-the-park style regulations known as height factor. Although DCP has developed a more recent set of regulations for contextual buildings that involve height limits and result in better designs, some sites, including NYCHA campuses, can't access those new rules. The proposed changes would allow height-limited infill on sites that would otherwise be forced to develop a tall, skinny building or nothing at all. A variety of other changes would address barriers faced by irregular or challenged sites. These changes include making more sites eligible for contextual envelopes, eliminating the outdated sliver law, which limits heights on narrow lots in favor of the height-limited contextual envelopes, and updating waterfront rules about building design, which currently make it infeasible to build housing, especially affordable housing, on the waterfront. The proposal also includes the creation of new zoning districts above 12 FAR. The maximum FAR for R11 and R12 districts would be 15 and 18 FAR, respectively. These zoning districts could only be mapped with mandatory inclusionary housing. The proposal would also create two new medium-density districts, R62 and R6D. These districts are intended to fill the gap in the existing spectrum of zoning districts. No mapping actions are part of City of Yes for housing opportunity, meaning a separate action would be required to map these districts if appropriate locations were identified. The landmark TDR program was created in the 1960s to relieve the financial burden on designated landmarks, which are subject to maintenance requirements and limited in their ability to redevelop or add new buildings to their lot. This proposal would allow landmarks to transfer development rights to more sites, including other zoning lots on the same zoning block as the landmark, or immediately across the street or an intersection from that block. The proposal would also streamline the approval process to a certification when no bulk modifications are necessary to accommodate the TDRs on the receiving site, or an authorization when an applicant is seeking bulk modifications. Currently, the program is not available for landmarks that are in historic districts or low-density R1 to R5 zoning districts. This proposal would expand the applicability of the landmark TDR program to these areas. These expansions of the landmark TDR program could help generate revenue to maintain landmarks while also unlocking additional housing opportunities. The railroad right-of-way special permit was created in the early 1960s to ensure that developments do not interfere with railroad operations and that the resulting development on these large and irregular sites is appropriate in bulk. However, the conditions of the special permit have become increasingly confusing, making it difficult to administer and resulting in significant cost and process burdens. This proposal would create clear definitions of what constitutes a railroad right-of-way and reduce or eliminate approval procedures. These changes could streamline the process while protecting the planning goals that were core to the special permit's original intent. Today's zoning includes rules that offer floor area exemptions designed to incentivize developers to include amenity space in buildings. Amenity space can include common areas or shared facilities like recreational space, laundry rooms, or trash disposals. The amenity rules can also be satisfied by including apartments with 3 or more bedrooms at the end of a corridor, incentivizing the creation of family-sized homes. These rules would be extended to all multifamily buildings, where today they're only available in high-density districts. They would also be simplified and updated to improve the incentives for building amenities. The proposal also includes changes to create better design outcomes. First, DCP would establish a new system of street wall regulation. Today's regulations often prevent new buildings from fitting in with neighborhood context. This framework, which would be based on building type rather than zoning district, would enable buildings to align with their neighbors. Next, split lots often face difficulties locating their floor area on a lot. Changes would provide additional flexibility for development rights to be shifted onto the higher density of the two portions of the lot. New York City has a diverse array of special districts that have been enacted to further neighborhood planning goals. As a general approach, the current proposal carries through any relevant changes to the special district in order to ensure these areas also have appropriate housing opportunities. But in order to be respectful to special districts, rules will be modified where the changes directly conflict with the special district's goals. For instance, many special districts have FARs that differ significantly from the underlying zoning, like R8 in portions of the special Clinton district. In those instances, the new UAP FAR would build on the special district FAR rather than simply eliminating it. The proposal takes a similar approach when considering the interactions of other components and the special rules contained in the special districts.
The environmental review for this citywide text amendment is intended to provide an estimate of the amount, type, approximate location, and overall form of future development to identify the range of impacts that may occur in the future with City of Yes for housing opportunity compared to a future without it. To do this, the environmental review used 3 methods of analysis as shown on this slide. Prototypical sites illustrate specific aspects of the proposal and how that could facilitate development at the scale of an individual site. Citywide estimates to quantify the range of future development outcomes at a citywide scale, and representative neighborhoods, which allow us to analyze collective effects of the proposal for density-related technical areas. The EIS estimates approximately 58,000 incremental units on the low end, up to 109,000 incremental units on the high-end scenarios. Citywide, this is a little less than a unit per acre over 15 years. For context, a typical block in eastern Queens is between 3 and 4 acres. This could mean the addition of a small multifamily building or a few ADUs being added to a block within the next 15 years. Some neighborhoods may see closer to 2.5 units per acre over 15 years under high-end scenario estimates. An environmental impact statement was conducted and a notice of completion for the draft EIS was issued on Friday, April 26, 2024. The draft EIS identifies no potential for impacts in the areas listed on the left side of the slide. Potential for significant adverse impacts are identified for categories listed on the right. It's important to note that for some site-specific impact analysis, potential for significant adverse impacts cannot be precluded. The likelihood of impacts occurring depends on existing context. For example, the potential for shadows impacts depends on sunlight-sensitive resources, and potential for noise impacts depends on the ambient noise context of a specific future development site. Other density-related impact analysis like open space and schools demonstrate that the additional populations introduced by City of Yes for housing opportunity at a neighborhood scale could strain existing infrastructure and result in the potential for significant adverse impacts. Mitigation measures are being explored and will be further refined in the final EIS. City of Yes for housing opportunity emerges directly from the goals outlined in the City's Fair Housing Plan, Where We Live NYC, and implements strategies from Where We Live. Specifically, Strategy 2.1 of Where We Live is to increase housing opportunities, particularly for low-income New Yorkers and amenity-rich neighborhoods. City of Yes for housing opportunity is advancing this goal through increasing housing options in low-density neighborhoods, such as encouraging missing middle housing types as well as ADUs, generating new opportunities to redevelop underused public properties through our campus proposals, and creating new affordable units in high-density neighborhoods through UAP. City of Yes for housing opportunity also advances Strategy 3.2, improving housing quality and preserving affordability for existing residents. UAP would support the creation of new affordable housing and would also serve to preserve existing affordable housing, as existing buildings of qualifying affordable housing could take advantage of the higher UAP FARs, as long as those units are permanently affordable. Lastly, City of Yes for Housing Opportunity Support Strategy 4.1, expanding the number of homes available to New Yorkers who receive rental assistance benefits. New income restricted housing enabled by UAP is particularly important for voucher holders, as the city has maximized opportunities for voucher holders to qualify for new affordable housing through the updated Housing Connect portal. Voucher holders are not subject to minimum income requirements and are eligible for units with rental prices covered by their voucher or rental assistance program. Overall, City Yes for Housing Opportunity represents the city following through on commitments made in where we live, to further fair housing and to address our housing shortage and affordability crisis. The changes we walk through today are the most significant proposals in City of Yes for Housing Opportunity. Overall, this text amendment aims to create a little more housing everywhere so that each neighborhood does its part to address our housing needs. And a few neighborhoods don't feel the intense pressure that they do today. It's not just about more housing, though. It's also about more types of housing. Multifamily housing, where it's currently not allowed because of exclusionary zoning, homes of different sizes to meet different people's needs, and crucially, far more affordable and supportive housing. Thank you all so much for listening to this presentation. This marks the beginning of the formal public review process. We look forward to your questions and comments today and to engaging with the public during the coming months.
Great. Thank you very much to both of you and to the entire team. I am going to just get things started, and then we'll turn to my colleagues. First of all, forgive me if I didn't note it and you didn't note it, but we did put out this illustrated guide for this proposal, which we recognize because it is a complicated proposal and has lots in it, that it's incumbent that we make best efforts to share these details in as accessible a format as possible. So that's what it was about. So thank you to the members of the Department of City Planning teams that put this together. It looks great. And also want to note that we shared the text of this proposal with community boards and the public several weeks ago as in a draft form so that people had a little more time with it, even though the process will not officially start until today. Now, let me ask my actual questions here, which is, you know, we're talking a lot about how certain neighborhoods have gotten shut off over time from the creation of housing. How has that happened? How did the city allow this to happen? And this obviously is not a past 2, 5, 10-year problem. This is decades in the making. How have we gotten to this point?
Great question, Commissioner. I'm John Mangin from our Housing Division, and I want to say also joined here by Stephanie Shalou and Alice Moskowitz, who are crucial to the environmental review, and Frank Rusciala from our Zoning Division, who led the text drafting effort. You're correct, Chair, that it was a very long process that got us here. You can boil it down, I would say, to a few crucial moments in zoning history. For our purposes, probably most significant is the 1961 zoning resolution, which for the first time really introduced restrictions that limited the amount of housing you could get on particular lots. And if you look at the consultant's report that informed the 1961 zoning, we went from a citywide capacity of 55 million, which, you know, of course, is just notional, to a capacity of about 11 million at that time. So you just get a sense of what a significant downzoning that was. Subsequent zoning changes over the years have sometimes increased that a little bit, sometimes decreased it a little bit. We definitely have seen since the 1980s, I would say, a series of increasing restrictions in the lowest density areas, such as the advent of low density contextual zoning. And then significant rezonings up to and including the Bloomberg era that really shifted the patterns of housing development in the city and overall made it extremely hard to keep up with the demand that we've seen in New York City, especially in the 00s and the 2010s into the present day. Much more to say about that, of course, but I'll leave it at that. Those are some of the significant milestones that led us to where we are today.
The way you and I have described this proposal regularly over past months, we talk about a little bit more housing in every neighborhood. And in the presentation today, we cited that would mean without dramatic changes, without taxing the infrastructure of local communities. Now, we're going to refer this out to community boards in a minute, and they will reasonably ask the hard question, how can you be so sure? How can you feel confident that this will not have a dramatic change in my neighborhood? And I certainly am sensitive to this. As many of you know, I was a former member of the city council, represented community boards, communities that were concerned about all of these things. So tell us how, a community board or any neighborhood should feel confident that this will not have a dramatic impact or not overly tax the infrastructure in their area.
Thanks, Chair. That's a great question as well. I just want to emphasize the extent to which the secret component of these proposals is just the geography, the breadth. It seems very simple, but we've never attempted to do something as geographically broad as we're trying to do starting today. Again, like Winnie and Veronica mentioned, from the lowest density districts to the highest density districts. And when we go that broad, we really can produce a significant amount of housing overall without significant changes in particular areas. And, the commission obviously sees rezonings, whether private rezonings or neighborhood rezonings. And when you see rezonings, typically you're looking at changes in housing capacity on a site that are at least 50% increases, usually more, 100%, sometimes even more than that. Because we're going so broad here, and because we're taking a limited text amendment approach rather than, zoning map changes in different areas all over the city, we can accomplish a lot with incremental changes. UAP, for instance, about 20% more housing in most parts of the city, as long as it's for permanently affordable. Or, reintroducing modest apartment buildings in low density districts, again, in opportune locations. And again, because we're going so broad, we can make changes to the zoning that are only incremental in nature. And we will hope that, developers and others take advantage of those. Even if they do in a widespread way, we do not expect significant changes in particular neighborhoods, definitely not on the scale you'd see in a neighborhood rezoning.
Thank you. Just a couple more from me. On the subject of parking and the parking mandate, so if we were to eliminate the parking mandate that exists in New York City, baked into the zoning resolution, applicable everywhere, and a developer wanted, or a neighborhood wanted to see more parking in their development, and they wanted to go up to 50% or 75% and 100% or whatever. Is there anything about this that would actually make that impossible?
No. We're proposing to provide additional flexibility by lifting parking mandates, but are not imposing any new parking maximums on any sites. In many respects, New York City is behind the curve on this one. And so we can look to other jurisdictions to see what happens when you do things like this. And we fully expect that developers can and will continue to provide parking, sometimes significant amounts of parking in parts of the city where they believe that's necessary to fill those units or what have you. And, we even see that today. I think the Commission's seen recent applications, whether in South Brooklyn or maybe Eastern Queens, where developers are building more parking than is even required today. Nothing would prevent that in the future either.
Okay, and last one from me on the dwelling unit factor. Maybe we do or do not want an apartment building which is all studio apartments. I don't know the answer to that question, but is there any reason why that possibility should be strictly barred in our zoning resolution? Is there any reason why we should have any pause and say, you know what, it's good that we have an absolute limit or an absolute ban on a building that is all studio apartments?
Thank you for the question. I can't think of any zoning reason offhand why we would want to restrict the size of apartments in that way. As Veronica and Winnie noted, there are other bodies of law, housing maintenance code, MDL, building code, et cetera, that control minimum unit size once you get to, potential health and safety concerns. But the zoning requirements are always gone beyond that and have always been redundant with those health and safety concerns.
Okay, thank you. Let me go to Commissioner Benjamin to be followed by Commissioner Goodrich.
Hi. Thank you so much for the presentation and for all the work you've done. I know how difficult it is to look at all of these things, and I must admit I've only gotten to Article 8 in reading all the text changes. And so I'm going to limit my questions not to actual questions about the zoning, and I'm going to give you a written copy of my questions about the actual text. So that would speed my questions along. Well, there's a couple of things that I'd kind of preface it with, since the period that you're talking about was a period in which I've been involved in land use the whole time. And we, the city of New York, had a policy change, as did the federal government. So I don't think we can blame it on happenstance or exclusivity, because I don't think the city of New York or the federal government, when they looked at Fox Street or the first developments that had this theory, I don't think people were looking to be exclusive. I think they were looking for ways to produce housing that would last. And the idea that came up from Dwarny and Zybeck and others was that income-restricted housing would be best if it was home ownership. And as a result of that, the city pursued, starting in the late 70s and early 80s, a variety of policies for single-family homes, or two-family or three-family homes, with the idea that they would provide both an asset to the owner and that that was the best way to provide affordable housing, with one or two rental units and home ownership required. We had a variety of programs, including Nehemiah and Partnership, that produced a lot of housing. And I say that as a preface to the fact that there are always unintended consequences. With the best of intentions, the city started these programs that, instead of using the FAR that was available, the city started the program that said, oh yeah, this is an R7 or an R8, but we're going to build a one-family house here. That was not the private market. With the result that we do not have as much housing as had been on those sites before. And so I look at these changes also through the prism of the unintended consequences that happen as a result of government encouraging certain types of housing or design with the best of intentions. So one of my first questions is, where are we mapping these new zones? Or 11 or 12, where are we mapping them? I know this action is not going to map them, but I want to know, and the new C zones, where are we mapping them?
Thanks, Commissioner Benjamin. We have not had those discussions yet about where in the city it might be appropriate to go above 12 FAR. So I personally don't have anything that I can say further about.
I will say that's a problem for me, that we don't have an idea where we would put this density. And I assume as this goes through the community board process, that many community boards are going to want to know, is that something you're contemplating for that community? Number two, I was wondering if the environmental review people developed and clearly they have, a development scenario that we could get a copy of.
I'll hand it over to Stephanie Shalhoub, Director of our Environmental Assessment and Review Division.
Thanks, John, and thanks, Commissioner Benjamin. The Chapter 2 of the Draft Environmental Impact Statement is the analytical framework chapter, and so it lays out the methodology that we use to develop the no action and the with action scenarios and the analytical framework that was used for the density-related environmental impact analyses.
And for the other issues, neighborhood character, or how did you?
When he touched over the prototypical sites, the citywide context, and the representative neighborhood assessment was the three-pronged approach that we used for the environmental review. So looking at the effects of the proposal at an individual site scale, scaling that up to neighborhood assessment, and then looking what does this mean for the context of the city. So it was intended to kind of use those building blocks to as different impact analyses. So the neighborhood character was basically the accumulation of the site-specific analyses.
And using the prototypical sites, they did not have any impacts at the local level, at the neighborhood level, or at the citywide level, is what you've...
For neighborhood character, yes, that's correct.
Okay. One question, thank you, that I've always had about MIH and now the UAP. In the initial rent-up, I understand how these income brackets work. But generally speaking, over time, people's income changes so that a developer may, 10 years down the road, the apartments may no longer reach those levels. They may be in excess of those levels. And they may no longer, on the areas where they can income average, the average may not be what it was at the initial rent-up. What happens then?
Great question. So at initial rent-up and at any subsequent rent-up of those units, they will have to comply with the AMI that's attached to them by the Affordable Housing Regulatory Agreement or by the restrictive declaration that's imposed on that development when it's first built. You're correct that it's not like a public housing unit, or it's not like Section 8 where you have to income certify again every year. And household incomes can and do change. We see that as a good thing. Often being able to occupy an affordable unit provides opportunities that extend beyond housing opportunity for educational opportunities or professional opportunities that we certainly hope will enable people to realize more of their earning potential over time, and that's a feature.
Hasn't that been a problem with Mitchell-Lama and with other developments where people are over income and the units that should be available to people who need them are instead occupied by people who are over income, and they may well be paying the surcharge that Mitchell-Lama requires, but the surcharge is so small compared to market rate housing that it doesn't really handle the problem. And the same thing is true in some of the other housing programs that we have, including HDFCs, that the income that people start with is not the income that they continue with, but they continue living there, and their families continue living there thereafter. I'm not throwing stones because my family moved into a Mitchell-Lama in 1963. When my mother died, my sister, who continued occupancy in the apartment. If something happens to my sister, my nephew is in occupancy. Whether he's qualified to be there doesn't matter. Once my parents moved there in 1963, you're right, their income, the income of the person and their entitlement to it doesn't change. And I was wondering if we could address that somehow.
I mean, you're correct that there are different income limitation regimes. Mitchell-Lama works a little differently from UAP, which would have fairly strict restrictions related to AMIs, again, at initial lease-up and afterwards. But
not if it's succession rights. So if you move into the apartment today and you are within the income requirements, but 5 years from now, you move out and your children stay, and they are not subject to the income requirements at all.
That's right. There would not have been a subsequent lease-up there. You know, again, we think it's fantastic when people get a perch in the brutal New York City housing market that enables them to, you know, realize some other types of opportunity, educational, professional, that enables their incomes to change over time. What we're doing here is to try to create more apartments like that. We're trying to significantly increase the amount of income-restricted units so that we don't have to, like, vacate existing units in order to give other families an opportunity.
But you do, because every time a new household is created, they're going to need a new unit.
Yeah, and that's why I would say the way that we're addressing this issue is to try to create as many new, perches in this housing market for families who may otherwise have difficulty affording housing in the city as we can. Winnie showed you the UAP slide where we did our little thought experiment and said, we think that if UAP had been in place since 2014, that we could have created an additional 20,000 income-restricted housing units. That's more than all existing inclusionary housing programs have created since their advent in the 1980s. And so we see the problem you're addressing and think that the best way to address it is not to try to vacate, kick families out of existing apartments because they make too much, but just to create as many more of those apartments as we can.
Commissioner, can I just ask, maybe in one or two questions? I just have a list. I can put you on the next round. I got you. I got plenty more time.
No, it's okay.
Okay, Commissioner Goodrich.
Okay, well, I'm another Commissioner Benjamin, so I have like 10 questions. So, I'm just kidding. Okay, not really. Okay, so, my first is a question and a comment. So I'll start off first by saying, one of my main issues with the work that we do is that we treat the housing crisis as though the housing shortage is the sole reason for unaffordable and high rent, and I don't believe that that's true. And so here we have an opportunity to have some of the units be affordable. I understand, again, we're talking about an additional 20%, and I'm a little bit disappointed about why we're not even starting with the starting point of at least 50%, because developers get tax breaks for this. And I know that having done this work, the reason is, this belief that, oh, well, then no one's going to want to build in the city, no developer is going to want to build if they have to build a whole bunch of what they refer to as subsidized housing. But then that's another form of having developers control and influence what the city does and what its platform and policy should be. So my question is there any opportunity here for the amount of the affordable housing, even though it's an additional 20%, yes, is there any opportunity to even have it start at 50?
Thanks, Commissioner Goodrich. That's a great question. So our philosophy here, it sounded like you were talking mostly about UAP and medium and high density districts, was to basically leave market rate floor area where it is, not touch that at all, and enable folks to build a little bit bigger as long as that was all income restricted housing. So, if you're doing anything extra under this proposal, it's going to be permanently affordable housing.
Can I clarify quickly?
Sure.
So just very quickly, one of the main issues we've had, as is the MIH, is that it's not as deeply affordable as we should be. So now we're trying to replace that with something. And so I understand that the weighted average would be 60, but that's still, like I said, I represent people who are Uber drivers, who are home health aides, and when they're thinking of affordable housing, most of them are not eligible for the majority of the affordable housing that we build. If you make less than $25,000, you can't get in there. So
no,
so my question is, why couldn't we start? Is there an opportunity to start even at least at 50% for when we have the affordable, for the amount of the affordable units?
Are you referring to 50% AMI or 50% affordability for the development?
50% affordability.
For the development?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. So we started from a premise of not wanting to take any development opportunities away from people. So leaving market rate where it is and then building on that. The reason why is if you take development capacity away from folks, you make it less likely that housing development will happen on those sites, which of course would be counterproductive if one of the main goals here is to try to build as much housing as we reasonably can.
So that's what I said, and so what I'm asking is, why are we even allowing developers to make those decisions and control?
Well, the idea was to the extent, if we are enabling developers to do anything more in medium and high density districts, it's strictly, income restricted affordable housing. And then we worked with HPD on AMIs. We agree with you completely. We hear the frustrations all the time that people can't qualify for the affordable housing that's available. That's why, driving down those AMIs from 80 to 60 is important, but also income averaging. That's, I think, the unsung hero here is if we do income averaging, then the zoning for the first time can get units at things like 30% AMI as part of a range, an AMI range in different developments. And that range is really important because today, if you're talking about an inclusionary unit, voluntary inclusionary unit, it's at 80% AMI and only at 80%. Not only is that too high, but if you don't earn 79% of AMI, you can't even apply for that unit in the first place. So by enabling income averaging, then we do expect to create units through the zoning for the Uber driver, for the home health aide, as part of that full range of affordability that we would create through this program.
In all fairness, I'll move on to my next question, but it's only a slight change, in my opinion. So my second question is more of a technical one. So with the ADUs, what I'm wondering is how this fits into the governor's new housing deal. Specifically, I guess I'm wondering if you have a house, you've had that house there from before 2009, and then it's your land, and then you build this ADU. Is that ADU covered under good cause? Do you know? Or the good cause deal is so, the whole housing deal is so much. I've read it, but I don't remember this being addressed, and so now I'm wondering it's already you're just building this little additional piece. Is that considered a new bill that is exempt from good cause, or is it considered just an extension of an existing building?
Thanks. Good question, Commissioner. I would say that our ADU proposal would enable ADUs for 1 or 2 family homes. So those would be below the size threshold that I understand is included with good cause. I'm not sure about your build year question, but the size threshold alone would probably remove those from applicability.
Okay, got it. I have a few questions from tenant groups. I will make it quick. One is from Crown Heights Tenants Union. This is from organizer Esteban Giron. He asks the size. If we're talking about the conversions of office to residential, ADUs, and some others, one of the concerns is that we already have a size issue of housing in New York City where, I think it was actually even mentioned in the presentation, it's just much smaller than it was before. And so one of the concerns is this idea of just building a whole bunch of dorm-sized apartments. I think the chair might have mentioned something about not having a whole bunch of studios, but I'm concerned about, the question here is the size of, is this housing plan allowing for a whole bunch of small-sized apartments to be built under the idea that, more housing, if anything, we just want more housing, even if it's 5,000 more units and they're small?
That's a great question as well. First off, when he said, when it comes to new income-restricted affordable housing, the bedroom mix requirements and size requirements would remain in place for those. So, HPD would continue to regulate that. What animates the small and shared apartments proposal, in large part, is the situation you see. And you mentioned Crown Heights Tenant Union. In neighborhoods like Crown Heights, where the unavailability of smaller units lead to situations where a bunch of college graduates join together and take those 2 or 3 bedroom apartments in places like Crown Heights. And who's going to be able to pay more in rent? 3 college graduates or a mother with 2 kids. It's one of the things. It's one factor that's responsible for the pressure that we see in neighborhoods like Crown Heights on rents generally, and especially on rents for multi-bedroom apartments. So we see this as creating some opportunities on the margin for a type of housing that in the past has been a good foothold for folks, just moving to the city, younger households, older households, smaller households, sometimes marginally housed folks, that we've basically rendered illegal since the 1950s and 1960s.
A follow-up question to the ADU. Actually, how many units would the ADU be? Would it be just one unit or two?
One.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah, that's right.
it would be under this threshold.
One ADU per one or two family home.
Okay, so if it's a two-family home, it'd be two ADUs?
If it's a two-family home, they would only get one ADU as well. So one ADU per one or two family home.
So it's also under the, it's also exempt under good cause? Because it doesn't meet is it 4 units? Four.
Yeah, I'm
Making sure it doesn't skirt.
It's not intended to go below. It's just the fact that, that typology is just so small that you'd have real difficulties with homeowners dealing with, broader state policies like you're talking about.
I guess I'm also just concerned about that as well because of just regulation as well, because with ADUs, there's always been some concern about the safety of them and so forth. So, okay, so another question from Crown Heights Tenants Union. Oh, someone said my mic is off stream. I'm literally reading the question, okay? So these changes make all neighborhoods start at the same place, but neighborhoods of color have already had an outsized level of development, so you just can't start as though we're all at the same level. This doesn't force the more politically connected, whiter neighborhoods to make up for not building for the past decade. So I think that question is about, we do want to address the fact that there hasn't been enough, there is a housing shortage, but it also starts at 0 for everyone. And so when we have these housing projects where it's only 20% affordable housing, sometimes in neighborhoods of color, it actually just leads, in my opinion, just leads to more gentrification as opposed to a more expensive neighborhood that it doesn't have as much an effect. So how would starting at 0, here the question is if it hurts.
No, that's
why is starting at 0 for everyone?
That's an absolutely fantastic question that is right at the core of the concerns that animate these proposals. We recognize first and foremost the immense pressure that neighborhoods like Crown Heights have been under, neighborhoods like East Flatbush, other neighborhoods who've come out to our public info session to talk about either the extraordinary amount of development in those areas or the number of people who are coming to those neighborhoods looking for housing and driving up housing costs there. The reason why, we believe so strongly in taking as broad an approach geographically as we have and enabling more housing in literally every residential neighborhood across the city is to take pressure off of those parts of the city that have seen extraordinary amounts of development or extraordinary numbers of people looking for housing that have driven up housing costs there. And when we enable housing, additional housing, we fully expect that it will flow towards the higher market areas that have been especially good at excluding development in recent years. The chair's initial question about how did we get to where we are today, we skipped over a lot of history that talks about decades and decades and decades of neighborhoods that may be a little better connected or whatever, or neighborhoods that have a little more money for consultants or things like that, who can get, more out of the land use process than maybe some other neighborhoods in the city. And that leads to unequal patterns of zoning capacity, unequal patterns of housing development that has put extraordinary pressure on neighborhoods exactly like Crown Heights. And that's fundamentally what we're trying to remedy with this extremely broad geographic approach.
So under this, and this will be my last question before I'll take a break, but so under this plan, for example, East New York and Upper West Side would have the same sort of mandate or the same expectation to build the same amount of housing, or?
Here's how I would put it, Commissioner, in response to that question. If you have the same zoning district, exact same zoning district in Upper West Side and in East New York, yes, the underlying changes to UAP would look the same. However, in a neighborhood like Upper West Side, this will represent new development capacity in a market that's extremely likely to use it. So I would expect to see, you know, that additional capacity taken advantage of in a place like Upper West Side in a way that would take some of the pressure off, you know, the few parts of the city that can develop today under the status quo because of, you know, the exclusion that we see in other areas of the city.
It's not a mandate.
There's no mandate. You know, basically what we're doing here is to enable a little bit more capacity in neighborhoods across the city. But, you know, like the slide that Winnie showed, zoning doesn't finance housing, zoning doesn't mandate housing to be built anywhere. We just change the rules, and then we can try to understand how that will alter development patterns. And with respect to the neighborhoods you're talking about, like the Crown Heights of the world, we expect this to be an extremely beneficial set of proposals.
All right. Thank you, Commissioner. I will just note, and I'm going to go to Commissioner Kamani in a second. You know, one of the points about the imbalance around the city, I think, is really fundamental to Commissioner Goodrich's questions, which is the 10 versus the 49. So 59 community boards in 2023, 10 of them doing the work for the other 49 on housing production. And, you know, that creates all the pressures of gentrification, displacement in those 10 areas. And so this proposal is really designed to open the door in the other 49 in a thoughtful but meaningful way so that we can reduce some of that pressure. It's important. Okay, Commissioner Kermani.
Thank you so much for the presentation, and to the whole department for all of the work on this. And while I have not read up to Article 8 and will not have written questions, I'm a big nerd of the 1961 zoning laws, which I stumbled upon when I was 20 in college, and I know, total dork moment. My questions are related to what we've heard from the commissioners who asked before me, but I guess I take it one step further and just ask that while there aren't mandates, and zoning does not mandate, which I totally accept, get 100%, and I'm sure you've had conversations about this, what does happen when community boards, council members say, not in my district? Do you think that because it is, and I'll just say this, it is inherently racist, a lot of the way that development has happened in this city over time, and communities that have bore the burden of development and developing housing that is deeply affordable. Do you foresee, like in other cities across the country, there have been lawsuits that have, most recently in New Jersey, I think I referenced this a couple meetings ago, that have forced communities to take advantage of the non-mandates, right? Like you have made it legally then in court, you have to do this. Do you think that New York City is a city, is there kind of that civic will, if you will, or political will to open that door?
Thanks, Commissioner. You know, as we embark on formal public review, we hope that as during our months and months of preliminary meetings with stakeholders, council members, and others, we hope that fundamental principle, a little bit more everywhere, looking to literally every neighborhood across the city to contribute, that it not only makes sense as a policy proposition, but that it does some political work as well. That people recognize that, you know, unlike a private rezoning in their neighborhood, or maybe sometimes like we hear around neighborhood rezonings, that this isn't, you're not being targeted. you know, this isn't just about your neighborhood or your community district or your council district, that we're asking everybody across the city to do a little bit. You know, we would hope to, you know, enact a sensible set of zoning regulations that enable housing to be produced more equitably across the city. We certainly hope we don't have to get to the point where you know, that people need to start suing us in order to accomplish that. Case law works a little differently in New York State than it does in New Jersey.
Yep.
So I do not see a Mount Laurel on the horizon,
Right.
but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do everything we can today, you know, in particular with respect to these proposals, to try to get to as good a place as we can at the end of this process. And so we're very excited to be starting that today.
And let me ask this as follow-up, like, who, for you, and this may just be opinion, like, to move something like this, I think these are really important changes, really, really important changes that do open the door. Who are the most important messengers?
I'm just represent the policy team on this. Fortunately, we are extremely well supported by, you know, community planning and engagement and others who are helping us reach out to all the people we need to reach out to in order to we hope, enact a great set of proposals.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'll see if there are other questions. Let me just take a second to note, one of the reasons why we feel optimistic about the moment that we are in is even with a very big and ambitious proposal, we have crafted in a way which we believe is designed to be respectful of all neighborhoods of the city. It is also consistent with the city's own policies, the Where We Live report. It is consistent with the City Council's legislation last year, which actually puts targets on neighborhoods and says we want every neighborhood to have a target goal for housing. It's consistent with the Speaker of the Council's State of the City speech, where she was calling on us to take action. It's consistent with members and borough presidents organizing on their own in support of housing supply and recognizing that a 1.41% vacancy rate is not a sustainable proposition for any of us. And, you know, even in the context of this proposal, we've already seen council members and at least one borough president on the steps of City Hall supporting, you know, the universal affordability preference component of this proposal, even, you know, a month before today when we're at our official day one. So, you know, your questions are excellent, and I, you know, recognize as much as anybody the complexity of doing something big and important in New York City, but I also think for the first time in my time in public life, people are really connecting the dots between the cost of housing, the gentrification pressures, homelessness, the imbalance of power between landlords and tenants, and the fact that we have a 1.41% vacancy rate. So we, the Department of City Planning, we will be a support to community boards and help them make their way through the proposal. We will do our best to lay it out as to why we think it makes sense and for everybody to do a little bit more housing in all neighborhoods. And we will also, you know, we were out on the steps of City Hall this morning with the mayor and with labor and business and housing advocates and environmentalists and many, many others who also see this as fundamental to the health of New York City. And so I'm encouraged. It's obviously a big and important proposal on a complicated and controversial topic, but I'm really encouraged for us to be going forward now at this moment with something that I believe that we can get across the finish line. Please, go ahead.
Just so it was, and I appreciate all of that and totally agree, just so it wasn't misinterpreted, when I asked who are the best messengers, that wasn't that you are not the best messengers, that was not a criticism of that. and in fact, Liz, Tammy, and I have had many discussions about this. But it was really about who are the best messengers outside of the department to support this and get the word out. That was the question. And there are all those groups on steps. That's wonderful. And as we know, kind of the least sexy part is implementation and making it happen, and how do we kind of make implementation sexy again, and who can, beyond the department, who can be helpful. That was the specific question.
Oh, good. How can we make implementation sexy again? You heard it here first. Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. Agree. Let me go to Commissioner Rampersad.
I'll be quick because a lot of the questions I was thinking about other commissioners have raised. I just want to make two quick comments. Looking at the transit area, I think it would be best, also, I think it would be great if when I look at Zola, I put in my office building, comes up on the NYC Zola transit area. I go to the building department, biz system, doesn't show it. I go to DOB Now, which is the new system DOB uses, it doesn't show it. I think it would be great to get all the agencies on board. I know I've mentioned this a couple of times, but I think it's very important. One of the things I want to bring is a scenario which I think maybe you can shed some light on with the ADUs. In Queens, for example, 30 by 100, two-family house, cellar first, second with an attic, and a garage in the back. The garage is built 1930s, whatever it is. It's not 5 feet off the line or anything like that. If they were to make an ADU, they can either choose the attic or the garage, correct?
Correct.
So the problem with some of these 1 and 2 families is there's no access to the attic unless they use the pull down. So one of the concerns I had was, does this trigger anything with sprinkler, number one? And I know that they want to create housing, but I think it's important that people know that if you're creating this accessory, is that going to be considered, it's not going to be considered a 3-family or multiple dwelling, is that right? Is that the correct?
It depends.
Okay. The reason I say that is because then triggers ADA accessibility, as you said, sprinkler. The other big thing I want to bring up is if they do convert their garage into the ADU, and, you know, typically, what do you do? We mentioned this when we first heard about this with DEP, with sanitary and even stormwater. I know I'm looking at, in the booklet that we have here, they show a scenario here where there's for a 1-family zone, a garage back there, limited to 2 stories, 25 foot in height, which is pretty big. But minimum distance on the lot line is 5 feet, and minimum distance between the ADU and the building is 10 feet. Problem is, when you have a dry well, you have to be 10 feet away from any foundation and 5 feet from any lot line. In most scenarios, I don't know, 30 by 100, you're not going to be able to do it unless DEP is changing and rolling back their restrictions. And even now, the way it is today, you have an existing house, you want to extend anything greater than 200 square feet, you have to go to DEP unless they waive it. I don't know if the agency we've been in talks with DEP to, figure out another way.
Gotcha.
To address that.
Thanks for the technical questions. As for your adding an ADU to a 2-family home, if you had an ADU within the 2-family home that's non-fire separated, then you're right, that would implicate the MDL. If it's detached, if it's attached and fire separated, then you could have a situation where you can add an ADU to a 2-family without triggering MDL compliance.
I'll give one scenario with that.
Okay.
I'll use my own house, for example. I have a legal 2-family,
Yep.
Detached. I'm already over my FAR if I was to use the attic. How does that work? Because it says 800 square feet, but it doesn't say 800, zoning square feet. So is that, I just want to
It's
clarify,
zoning square
what does that
feet.
mean?
So,
Not to be technical, I just want to know, so.
it's part of the underlying adjustments to low-density districts. I mentioned how we've made zoning increasingly restrictive in low-density areas such that many existing buildings there are overbuilt. So as part of our underlying changes, we're providing a little more floor area across the range of low-density districts that could be used to get you out of your underbuilt condition, or on some lots to enable the addition of an ADU, for instance. Your questions highlight the fact that what's possible depends very much on the particularities of a given site. Is it the case that our ADU proposals will enable one for every single 1- and 2-family home? Absolutely not. But it will create an opportunity on the margin for a significant portion of those 1- and 2-family homes, and some of those will choose to use it. As with any changes to zoning, we learn from what happens, and keep an eye on those things in the future. It's possible that adjustments would be made in the future if these are too strict. But lots and built conditions and lot sizes in places like New York City are different from a 5,000, 7,500 quarter-acre lot in California or something like that. So we're doing our best to enable ADUs on a wide variety of 1- and 2-family homes in New York City, but yes, you're correct that by no means will all of them be able to do it under these proposals.
Okay. I'll have other questions, but I'll just write it and send it in.
Thank you, Commissioner.
And one more thing, and on your, we are, ADUs in particular, we're working with an interagency team with BOB, with FDNY, with Mach-E-J, with DEP, and others, on implementations and making sure that we're adequately protecting health and safety on those issues. So we're definitely in close touch with DEP on that.
So now that you bring that up, what have those other agencies said, like FDNY and DEP? Have they've looked at this already, I take it, or? Oh,
of course. Yeah, there's there are regular meetings on that on the calendar. And there are various types of health and safety to keep an eye on, and FDNY and DEP in particular have been crucial on that front.
And well, I think, so have you guys made modifications based on their feedback?
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Marin.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation thus far. I want to go back to one of the questions that was asked by both Commissioner Benjamin and Commissioner Goodrich, and this is the loss, the thought of loss of an affordable unit based on someone's economic standing increasing and therefore losing that 30, 60, or 90% AMI unit. And I don't know if this is a question or if this is just a thought so that HPD can posit and people would think about it. But I would posit that in a situation where you're given the 20% extra units, so let's start out with a number 100, and you're given 20% more units because you're utilizing the universal affordability preference. Is there any way of considering then a unit that gets lost, not lost, a unit that's where someone is progressing economically, that the next market rate unit or a unit of higher AMI be considered to be lower to then meet the loss of that one unit that you had? And it's really not a loss, I understand that, it's a perceived loss, but it's still, to me, a way of preserving the original intent of the 20%, because at some point, that 20% will no longer be an affordable cohort, right? They're going to move into a different cohort. So I don't know, again, if this is a question or a thought for consideration, but between HPD and the Department of City Planning and all those others involved in housing that are planning for this, I think consideration should be made for that, because that thought is clearly in everybody's mindset. And as a housing practitioner, I know that you do lose those units. For example, the housing partnership homes that were built were intended to keep at a certain AMI, and houses that were built at 150,000, depending on the neighborhood, were sold for millions. And you lost that unit of affordable housing. And here we're going to be facing that same concept if we don't put plans in place or mechanisms in place to try and replace the lower end of the spectrum that we're losing as a result of economic progression.
Thank you. That's a good comment, and HPD's watching, and we can discuss it as part of our interagency team on that. Again, that unit will remain income restricted at 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, whatever it is for the life of the building. And so, while we certainly hope that families who are able to get an income restricted housing unit, that their economic situation improves as the decades wear on, if and when they vacate that unit, boom, you're back to 30, 50, 60, 80, whatever it was in that original unit. So we don't consider, that a loss under
I do understand that, but I'm also a landlord, and I'm going to give you an example. I have had tenants that refuse to move because of the rent being so low from when they started, and there's like 20 people in the apartment, in a 3-bedroom apartment. So people will do what they need to do to keep their economic standing, to do what they feel is right, and you won't have that 30% unit. So you really need to think about this. This is something that needs to be considered. Otherwise, we're going to get to a point that we're going to say, well, now we have to create another type of mechanism to get more affordable units at the 30 or 60% AMI level. And we have but so much limited land to go both up and across.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Cerullo, followed by Commissioner Osorio.
Thank you, Chair. Okay, so I'm just gonna, there's so much, this was really good comments and conversation today. There's so much going on, my thought process on this. I'm just gonna quickly focus on a couple of things that were in the presentation. On the new zoning districts, there was a note, was on page 34 in the presentation that said that zoning districts above 12 FAR would automatically be MIH districts. Is that correct?
Yes, correct.
What happens in the, you had the example of R6 and then you had like a D and an N. What happens in there if they're moving from, if they're new districts, are they significant enough differences, it's not clear, that would otherwise have triggered MIH, or is it you're considering them all R6s, and so there would be no automatic MIH designation in the creation of those districts, wherever they may be?
Great question. It depends on your starting point. As the Commission knows, you know, you're typically applying MIH when there's been a significant increase in residential capacity.
Exactly.
So if you were going from an M11 to an R6D or an R62 or whatever, that would be a significant increase in residential capacity, and then that 3 FAR would be an MIH FAR.
I understand that completely. What I didn't, and if that was obvious to me, I wouldn't have asked this question. So the way I had read that chart, which again is probably just an example, was that you were breaking down the R6 into multiple categories, not going from 4 to 6. That I would have understood wouldn't have changed. So my question is, within an existing zoning category where a new zoning category grows out of it, are you just still considering it part of its parent zoning category, or are you deeming it now significant enough? I guess that's the point. Are we changing the definition in any way that in this change it would trigger MIH or not?
Well, think of it this way. So if we map a 15 FAR or an 18 FAR district, that would inherently be a significant increase in residential capacity that would trigger MIH. With a 3 FAR district, that's not necessarily the case, and so it comes in 2 different versions. It comes in the MIH version with a max FAR of 3 and option 1, option 2, option 3, option 4 attached to it, or it comes in a UAP version as well, where you'd have a market rate cap of 2.5 and an affordable supportive cap of 3. Does that make sense? And so if you were rezoning an area, you know, this is probably not particularly likely, but that has, you know, a 2.43 max today or whatever, and you're going up to just 3 FAR. You're just adjusting it for one of these new R6Ds or something like that. That would not represent a significant increase in residential capacity, and so you'd have more of your UAP FAR, 2.5 market rate max and a 3 affordable supportive.
Okay, I understand. I just wanted to get a sense of, because it was so specific that over 12 was going to be automatically mapped to MIH, which I understand. I just wanted to understand what we were doing within a category, but we weren't actually, or I didn't know how you were defining breaking out an existing zoning category, and I'm assuming creating more flexibility within it, because the numbers, the FAR was changing in those. I don't remember from earlier, it was days ago that we saw that. Okay, I have that. Here's a quick question. What is the difference in definition between low density and medium density? Is it R3 into R4? Where is the line when we are calling things low and medium?
Gotcha. Typically, historically, low density has meant R1 through R5 family, and medium and high have represented R6 through R10 family. Now I guess we're heading up to R12.
Okay, so low density is R5, you're saying?
Right. R5 family tends to be in the low density area. On larger sites there, ostensibly you can get multifamily. We've seen less and less of that in those districts as the decades have worn on. But yeah, low density does encompass one family districts, two family districts, and some small multifamily districts.
Okay. And under the area where we talked about transit-oriented development and the 3 to 5 stories, and then the term, what was said was, depending on the underlying zoning, just want to understand what that qualification means. And so what does that qualification actually mean and practically?
So we are not giving, for instance, a flat 2 FAR to all large sites and low density districts within the transit zone. If you're in the low end of that spectrum, you would just get 1 FAR, and you'd be able to use that on your large site and your transit in order to build a 3-story building. You'd have a 35-foot height limit. Now, if you're up in R5 land and you have a large site within the transit zone, you'd get a full 2 FAR and you'd get up to 55 feet so that you could do up to a 5-story apartment building. So it's not just a flat thing across the full density. There is gradations within the low density categories.
Understood. Appreciate that. It makes sense. The other sort of thing that was referred to in this section had to do with it being it had to be on the wider part of the street. What happens on a corner lot?
Okay, that's great.
Like the wider part of the street, I picture middle of the street, it's on the wide street. What happens when the site is on a corner of a wide and narrow street?
Well, a couple things there. Thanks for highlighting the additional locational criteria there. To reiterate, you'd have to have at least a 5,000 square foot site within the transit zone, and you need to be on a wide street that is 75 feet or above, or the short dimension of a block. And so if you had a site that was on a corner of a wide street and a narrow street, that would count as frontage on a wide street. It would also likely count as short dimension of a block as well. Most blocks we see, will have at least one side of that rectangle will represent a short dimension of the block, where these the missing middle proposals would have applicability.
Okay, I thank you, and thank you for that. And those were there were a few others, but
and you might say
not critical at this point. But I will say something that just thinking this through, a couple of things. Everything we do here is really just to provide options, right? And unless the city's going to come in and build everything we need, which or any level of government is going to come into our city and build everything we need, it has to make sense for the private sector to actually engage in the options. And so I think that's an important thing for us. And I'm not saying this makes sense. I don't know. I don't know what anyone will engage in. We've seen this historically in zoning. But we know what's not working, so we're attempting to fix that. I would say that an interesting, and in the very beginning, Chair, when you said, how did we get here, in the dialogue between I think Commissioner Kermani made a good point when she referenced sort of the process of how things get approved here. The politics of the moment and of the time has such an impact on whether we engage or we don't, right? Or what changes take place in our neighborhoods. Our elected officials are responsive to the things that communities want and don't want. We've seen that even in the existing period of time with MIH, with flexibility to build higher and bonuses to build more. Applications come here and then floors get chopped off and units get taken out and affordability levels get completely changed. And so I feel like that's a piece of this story that it was more about, 1961 zoning. It was all about the books. It wasn't about the process. And I think even in this, we're going to see that doesn't end, even with changes that we could execute on today. And the other thing is, and it would be interesting to know, and I don't know if the staff knows now, but certainly as a follow-up, the idea that the 10 community boards that have sort of bared the burden, so to speak, if that's the correct expression, of the new development, how much of that land was vacant, developable land in those neighborhoods? And how many of those neighborhoods were focused on because mayors, city government focused on those neighborhoods to build in and created the footprint like we're looking to do today to focus on those areas. Nothing a community wants less than a big giant building next door to them and then being forced out because they can't afford to be there than they do having neighborhoods knocked down to build new in. I mean, there's so many already built out neighborhoods in this city that unless you're coming in and you're going to tear down the area to rebuild, there's only so much room to do. That's why I love the sort of adding the floors and things that are already built. So I don't know what the answer to that is. I don't know in those 10 community boards, but I would be interested to know how. I mean, I know some buildings, maybe there's a building on a lot, they're going to knock that one down, but the lot is basically open. How does that fit into this formula? And should we be thinking about it? It's not so much, it's about building up. We're going to run out of space to build this way without just going up all the time. And how much can our city and the infrastructure and how much can we bear? So anyway, you know, people love their neighborhoods. They don't want change. But at the same time, creating the footprint alone doesn't make it happen. And I think we need, you know, I know we know that. We see it every day. But I just wanted to comment on that because everyone's had really good comments about how do we get here and how do we get out of this, or how do we create a new sort of journey for building housing in our city that's affordable and becomes part of existing communities. That's the other thing. We're not really building new communities. We're trying to marry new into existing communities that people love. So it's not easy, but I appreciate all the work that you've done in this.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Osorio.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks so much for the presentation and the work. I really wanted to start by acknowledging a couple things that I thought are really important. One is the quality of the materials. I mean, I second what the Chair said in terms of producing a guideline that is really conveying what's otherwise really complex information to the public. And I think that this is different from the previous versions of housing City of Yes. So I really want to start there. Second, I'm really excited about an EIS. I'm looking at Stephanie and sort of saying, like, this is cool. This is what a lot of us were hoping would also happen in the previous ones. So this is really interesting, and it's an opportunity for engagement. It's really an opportunity to talk about the research behind your decisions, and I commend you for that. Thanks specifically for sharing the GIS files. It's for me, it's really important to begin mapping this information and to have access to that at such an early stage. Is with everything that you have, you know, in the pipeline is something that is very much appreciated. I also just wanted to make a comment about the scoping session. I was really impressed with the diversity of comments and the amount of people that participated. I, at the point, was a little bit surprised by how at that stage in the process, people were already saying yes or no to it. And so, you know, that's not a criticism to you, but it's maybe an opportunity to think about why even elected officials showed up, you know, in support or against about something that hadn't even been sort of like yet crystallized. Having said that, I'm also very impressed with the quality of the responses to each comment that you got in writing, and so that's been really useful. Thanks for sharing that. I have a couple questions that I'm going to try not to repeat, but really just build on what has been said, which I feel have been really important comments. The first is a big picture question following up on what Commissioner Cerullo just said. So what does success look like? I mean, one way to think about this is that we are doing this comprehensive analysis to address all of the restrictions that zoning is basically creating for us to maximize the amount of affordable housing that we can produce, right? But what do you think is going to happen? And actually, in some of the responses to the comments, when people were asking about scenarios where we may actually have the unintended consequence of maximizing density where we shouldn't, you hinted that that's when we would have a rezoning, right? And so I'm wondering if it is accurate to say that at some point, we may see less rezonings. Is that the idea, that, we will be addressing the underlying impediments so that we can maximize the development capacity that is allowed right now so that we don't have to, rezone every 2 weeks? Or what do you think is sort of like success along those lines?
That's a great big picture question. Ultimately, success of these initiatives depend on whether we're actually creating meaningful housing opportunity for families in New York City. And that would mean that the housing market feels different from what it does today. People have mentioned the fact that how many members there are of this growing coalition of folks, of people who understand the issue here, the housing shortage and its human consequences. So we just want to work with them in order to create additional housing opportunities for families across the city, and just so that the housing market can feel different. You mentioned individual rezonings or neighborhood rezoning efforts. It sometimes gets lost that these efforts are complementary to that. This is, to say it ad nauseum, a little bit more everywhere. In situations where we're making more significant changes, that's really a situation where you do need a neighborhood planning effort where people go site by site. All the stakeholders get together and go site by site in the Gowanus or something like that to talk about how the neighborhood actually will significantly change in the future. And we have important neighborhood planning efforts going on as we speak, as you know. So this is not meant to replace those. This is meant to complement them. And because of, the limits to an approach like this, the changes really are incremental in most places. The housing opportunity proposals will not address those situations where more significant changes to zoning in a neighborhood or on a site or whatever would be appropriate. We're not trying to identify those sites and address them with this effort. So I fully expect that neighborhood rezonings, private rezonings of smaller areas will continue into the future. But this is an important part of the overall approach that we have to take to make sure that our zoning is adapting to the needs of our city.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, maybe at another point, I would like to know, how are we going to evaluate that? We know that it's complex, and we'll see how it goes. But it will be important to also, as a planning effort, to define some benchmarks, some milestones, some indicators that we can use to see if it worked or whether we have to further adjust. But to go back to your response, I also understand that. I mean, it's clear that the initiative wants to maximize the amount of housing that can be built. That's clear to me. But I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about what is the right mix that you're hoping for? What is the mix between market rate and affordable housing units that can be produced? I mean, I'm wondering if along the lines of the numbers that you shared in the presentation, I think Winnie was who presented this, what percentage of those units are we hoping are going to be affordable housing? Like, do we have those numbers? Also, what is the desired, we don't know what's going to happen. I want to be clear, but what is the desired mix between rentals and owner-occupied? Like, in that scenario that you're envisioning, the scenario that you want to facilitate, what's the right mix?
Gotcha. That's another really good question. These are a series of proposals that are intended to work across the range of neighborhoods from the lowest density to the highest density. In medium and higher density districts, where you have a typology that can support significant amounts of affordable housing, The name of the game there really is trying to create more income-restricted affordable housing units than all of the inclusionary programs to date have, and they go back to the 1980s. When you go to the lowest density districts, the name of the game there is really ending the type of creeping exclusionary zoning that we've seen there, where even if you go back to the 00s or the 90s or the 80s, we were producing a significant amount of housing even in those areas as well. That's just not the case today. Now, there are typologies there that have an extremely difficult time supporting income-restricted affordable rentals. Sometimes you can get affordable homeownership opportunities in low-density districts, and so we're exploring those very carefully with our partners at HPD. But there, we just want to ensure that we're seeing housing production in those areas with a range of typologies that are within reach, to families who might not be towards the wealthier end of the spectrum. So it's a difficult question to answer just because our approach is so different across the different ranges of densities.
But couldn't we apply the same methodology to the maximum number of the minimum number of housing units that we can produce to estimate how many affordable housing units, what percentage of those based on sort of like the configuration of the proposals? I mean, couldn't we use the same method?
Well, it's tricky because when we're talking about overall numbers of affordable units, a lot of those are expected to come through 100% affordable regulatory agreement projects, which isn't something that gets baked into the environmental impact statement, typically for reasons of wanting a conservative estimate. So that would be going someplace that environmental review has not gone in the past, which is something we only do very, very carefully.
Okay, thank you. I have another question. I have two very quick questions. One is specifically about the methodology in the EIS, building a little bit on Commissioner Benjamin's questions. But so why is the market study, the housing market study, only focusing on market capacity and density? Going back to some of the earlier questions, and with a racial equity report that is very clear in terms of the histories and the struggles in these communities, why aren't we looking at racial and ethnic composition of these neighborhoods, displacement risk? These are indicators that are there. Flooding, storm surge, environmental justice. Like, why limiting the market study in that way? In other words, limiting the categories under which we've categorized the different options. And by the way, I should also say that I commend the three-tier approach to the EIS. That's the way that I read that is that you're identifying the limitations of each of them and trying to get us as close to what we potentially know about what's going to happen. But that's a specific question that I feel, I also saw in the comments throughout, and I'm wondering, why did you limit it that way? Or if it's possible to do this in the final EIS. I mean, we heard also today, what about race and equity in terms of the histories of these communities, given the fact that some of them have been targeted in the past?
That's a great question. If you have more technical questions about the market study, I can get Alex up here. For the market study as part of the environmental review, we want to stick as closely as possible to the legal requirements under state and local law for environmental review. And so we created the market study and other components of the environmental review consistent with those. We are excited to do the racial equity report for this proposal as well, largely because, the crux of a racial equity report is that consistency assessment with where we live, the city's fair housing report. And, I worked on where we live back in 2020 with HPD as well, when we were trying to devise all the goals, strategies, and concrete actions in Chapter 6. And, I have to say, when we were devising particular measures for that chapter, there were things that we put in there that, would obviously be good, would move the needle on affirmatively furthering fair housing, but, it seemed like a political reach at the time. So we're very proud now to be including all of those things in the housing opportunity proposals and to do a racial equity report that really highlights the consistency of these proposals with the goals, strategies, and actions outlined in where we live.
But are you open to including some of the results from the race equity report in how you're categorizing the neighborhood tabulation areas?
Gotcha. I also worked on the racial equity report legislation as well, and are trying to ensure, largely for legal reasons, that the environmental review and the racial equity report remain distinct, remain complementary, remain independent sources of information without trying to mix them together in a way that could potentially create legal vulnerabilities. Oh, sorry.
No, just wanted to add that the market study was intended to inform our expectations about how much development capacity we thought would be uptaken in different neighborhoods depending on that characteristic, but we did ensure that the neighborhoods that were analyzed through the environmental review represented a range of conditions. So there are just so many permutations. Each neighborhood is different and has a range of characteristics, so it was very difficult to slice and dice to account for every permutation or combination of different characteristics, but we ensured that the analysis that was conducted looked at a range of those factors.
That's very useful, thank you. And maybe perhaps later I want to engage in a more detailed conversation about it, because I'm not asking about whether they're representative or not. I'm just saying that in framing the analysis, we're leaving behind really important characteristics of the histories of these neighborhoods that actually respond to their specific characteristics. And on one end and on the other, how do we measure indirect displacement in places where something happening here will create speculation all around? And so anyway, just for thought, another. Oh, go ahead.
Thank you for these comments. We're definitely taking everything in and figuring out how we can strengthen the final.
Thank you for that. One last quick question, if I may. This is just really quick. On the ADUs, I was really happy to see, and I think Winnie also mentioned this in the presentation, I think is Winnie, that the ADUs will be restricted to the to the high-risk zone, and that's critical. Of course, I would have expected maybe like more, if not the moderate, in other words, the 500-year floodplain, the stormwater inundation vulnerability, because a lot of the neighborhoods are not even waterfront communities. But they inundate every time that it rains. And so, I'm wondering if you're open to considering the characteristics of neighborhoods that are flooding, every now and then and are not waterfront, therefore are not subject to the 100-year floodplain.
Great question, and of course, those conversations are ongoing, not only with, Maki-J, DEP, and our other interagency partners on ADUs, but also with community boards, members of communities as well. We fully expect to have a very involved conversation on precisely those issues over the course of public review.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Commissioner. Before I go to round two, anybody else for round one? Actually, I think we may have covered just about everybody. Okay, all right, great. Let me go to Commissioner Benjamin and Commissioner Goodrich.
Okay, I have, thanks again. I have some additional questions. The first set have to do with the ADUs. In reading the text, part of the text proposes to limit rear yards to 20 feet. And the ADUs say that an ADU that's permitted obstruction in the rear yard has to be 10 feet from the main structure and 10 feet from the rear lot line. So it doesn't seem like you can have, and then it has to have 5 feet from the side yard. So it seems like the volume that's left in which you could build something is like 12 feet. So is it that we're just not expecting in new constructed 1 and 2 family districts that we're not going to see ADUs, and we're only going to see them in older constructed units that have a 30-foot rear yard? Is that kind of the department's thinking?
Similar to Commissioner Ramprashad's question, we don't expect that every typology will work on every zoning lot. While we are proposing to reduce rear yard requirements to 20 feet, we're also enabling permitted obstructions for a portion of the rear yard for ADUs as well. And then, for some sites, you would have maybe you would see a basement, or you would see an attic, or something like that. We certainly don't expect in particular that a detached rear yard unit is going to work for your typical 30 by 100-foot lot or 25 by 100-foot lot.
So you're not really looking at different neighborhoods for these different typologies. You're just assuming that there are different typologies and people will respond, the market will respond accordingly.
Right. You try to define an appropriate universe of typologies with the understanding that, you know, a massive single-family zoning lot in one neighborhood might be perfect for a detached rear yard ADU, whereas other neighborhoods where the housing is a little more tightly packed, maybe you get a basement or an attic.
And I think it was Winnie who spoke about there would be additional regulations that are going to be developed for ADUs. Are they going to be developed before we see this back, or are we not going to see them and just have to assume that they will answer or address the concerns that we have about where and how ADUs would be permitted?
That's a good question. The conversations with our interagency team are ongoing, and part of that is determining where the appropriate locus for different types of regulation is. Sometimes it makes sense to have restrictions in the zoning. Other commissioners have pointed out that there are restrictions on ADUs, for instance, you know, subgrade ADUs in the 100-year floodplain, or prohibitions in special coastal risk districts. In other instances, maybe around, you know, stormwater flooding, the appropriate location for those restrictions is in other bodies of law. So that's part of the conversations that are ongoing.
Okay, because one of the big issues that happened in places like Forest Hills and certainly in brownstone neighborhoods where I live is sewer surcharge. And I would hope that when we talk about basement apartments, since sewer surcharge is a regular occurrence with just a little rain in many of these neighborhoods that are not in the 100-year floodplain, that would be one of the things that will be examined, and that the regulations will protect people from occupying spaces where they would be subject to regular sewage overflows.
Thank you.
And I just want to be absolutely clear on one question. ADUs do not have income requirements. You can charge anything you want, is that right?
Yeah, there would be no income requirements in the zoning.
And last but not least on it, on this topic, the last question on ADUs, I understand that the ADU, whether it's in the basement, the attic, or what, and whether it's in the rear yard, is not counted against FAR if it's in the rear yard.
No, ADUs will represent zoning floor area. There are no exemptions for ADUs in terms of a floor area.
Even though it's a permitted obstruction?
Right, that just has to do with where it can locate. We will have certain non-compliance provisions where if you have the ability otherwise to carve out an ADU from within an existing structure, so a basement or an attic within an existing structure that would render you overbuilt, we will permit it in that limited circumstances, in that limited set of circumstances, but you would not, you know, for instance, get a floor area exemption for that ADU. It would just be permissible overbuilt status.
So how would that work? I'm Raj, and I own my house, and I decide that I'm going to put in an outside stairway, and I'm going to convert my attic. I'm going to put an outside stairway within my 5-foot rear yard so that my new tenants can go up and come down. That would put me over my FAR. And because I don't have 5 feet from the stairway, it might make me out of compliance with my side yard requirements, depending on how I build it. I thought that you could not increase the amount of non-compliance without going to BSA. And in reading through the provisions, I certainly saw that you couldn't increase the amount of non-compliance, nor could you create non-compliance, but I don't see in many circumstances how the ADU can avoid creating new non-compliances.
You're right. On certain lots, it will be very difficult to add an ADU. But if the zoning allows it, then that's not a non-compliance. So in certain limited instances, we would enable you to carve out an ADU from within an existing structure. The building's not getting any bigger, in a way that would enable you to go over what would otherwise be the floor area cap. But, you know, under the zoning, that would be a complying structure that would not have to go to the BSA because it's allowed by the
And if my house burned down to the ground, could I rebuild it with that?
That I'd have to come back. I want to noodle over that philosophical question. And
I mean, I'm
come back.
concerned that we're creating this category that by its nature is more likely to have a certain level of, let's not call it non-compliance, let's call it unusual, different compliance. And that those structures, whether it's the dormers in the attic that Raj puts in order to raise his pitched roof, or whether it's the stairway, that those things are not by the rest of the community that has to insure it or give a mortgage for it. They're going to want to know whether, in fact, this can be rebuilt. When Raj wants to borrow the money to build that stairway and to the dormers, the bank is going to want to know that it can be there forever. So my questions along those lines just have to do, and maybe we should just do that privately. I'm concerned about that we're either creating new things for BSA, different things, but new things that people will have to go to make changes, or we're concerned about giving people the ability to change their kitchens and other things, but if they're non-complying because of this, then they can't. They have to go to BSA.
Right. The only non-compliances allowances in the presentation that we presented today are, you know, for ADUs if you want to carve out an ADU from within an existing structure, or if you want to build one within the footprint of an existing structure. And I take your point on that. If, you know, there was some damage or destruction, how would that be treated legally? But in general, I think that's a relatively specific situation, and I don't expect that we're creating a bunch of additional work for BSA. We're just trying to create a reasonable set of allowances that can reach the range of homeowners who could benefit from a little more space or a little more money.
And last but not least, my last question has to do with something that wasn't mentioned in the presentation at all, but is something I spent 2 years working on, so I have lots of concerns, which is parking in houses of worship, which you're eliminating. That was a very, very big deal. Communities all over the city wanted more parking because the local church where everybody, or synagogue where everybody walked, except for the Hasidim who walk, was no longer a local place. People drive to get to church, people drive to drop their kids off. Most houses of worship have all sorts of programs and people drive to them. My assumption is you're eliminating that so that churches can use that space, if they have it, for new housing. But how are we serving the community? The communities were very upset, and I have seen it, having studied it, that on Sundays in many neighborhoods, cars are double and triple parked by the churches. And if you've ever tried to get your car out, you can't. So how are we going to address that?
That's a great question as well. Part of our efforts have involved speaking with faith-based organizations across the city and working closely with the mayor's, faith-based affordable housing task force. In my experience, the churches that need their parking and are not going to avail themselves of this. We heard that from the churches themselves. No. Members of our congregation have over the years left the city, moved to the burbs. They come back on the weekend. We need our parking. We would never use that. Great. They don't have to use it. Other congregations have said, we have empty parking lot that where the parking's still required. We would love to be able to do something, that serves our mission with this site, whether that means more housing or more church or, whatever. Again, it's up to them, but parking can represent a significant constraint there. And then in between,
they could have come for a waiver and reduction in the existing zoning if they could show that, in fact, their congregations were local, and the chair could give them a chair cert. We could.
Yeah, if that cert were applicable, and when I started at city planning and council division 10 years ago, and I remember I was at a picnic one time, and Carl Weisbrod, who was chair at the time, came over and he asked me about a locally oriented housing of worship certification, and it had been in process at city planning for 5 years, 6 years, and he said, "Can you just grab these folks by the hand and just take them across the finish line?" Even that level of process can represent an insurmountable obstacle for, congregations that, may not have the savvy to hire a lawyer and come in for that cert. So we see it as an opportunity for those churches that want to do stuff with their land that may not need the parking. I was going to say there was a category in the middle where churches said, okay, can we redevelop our site and just have parking on the ground floor? Maybe that's an option too. So
yeah, I would ask you to look at that, because communities all over have been upset about parking. I know you said a church may not need it, but that's not what's going to make the determination. What's going to make the determination for a church many times is if they can sell this for a boatload of money. Yeah, and so if we could find some middle ground, if you could think about it, about some way that we could have some level of parking or waive parking, I would be much more comfortable than just eliminating it and saying, go for it.
Okay, noted.
Thank you, Commissioner. We're going to finish up with Commissioner Goodrich.
Bless you. I said, bless you.
I have two very quick questions. One is a follow-up, and it's a question that I've wondered a lot and I get a lot, which is, since we are talking about building housing, is there a particular reason why there isn't more investment in city-owned housing? Like sometimes a rarity we get 100% affordable housing, or even not just rental housing, but say Michelamas. I've been wondering about that. I get that question quite a bit about when we're talking about housing policies, why it's only rentals. So I'm biased, like Commissioner Benjamin. I grew up in a Michelama.
That's an absolutely great question. I would say that in the time I worked for city government, there's been a big shift back towards affordable homeownership. It may have been buried in there, but we are making some changes to our existing affordable housing programs, UAP, but also MIH, to make it work better with affordable homeownership. We're excited that we think some of those missing middle proposals for modest multifamily buildings in lower density districts, a lot of those are going to be too small for 100% rental buildings, but we think that they hit a sweet spot for affordable homeownership. And I can say that recently a number of city council members have, really taken the lead on putting homeownership back on the map as well. And so, when we talk to HPD, when we talk to council members, especially in certain parts of the city, this is like the first topic of conversation, and we're all working on it. And we think that these housing opportunity proposals, while they don't allocate any money for housing or anything like that, are an important piece of making that type of housing more possible than it is today.
Okay. My second question is it's not my question, it's another question from a tenant group, Crown Heights Tenants Union. So I'll start with a comment. This proposal essentially strips review power from community boards, making a lot more development as of right. It's ridiculous to ask community boards to give up the power to review simply to make it easier for developers to make money. We are already only advisory, so we're more like an annoyance than an impediment. So I guess the question is, in terms of, because this comes up quite a bit, and I think it's also another imbalance issue, which is sometimes these phrases are thrown around like NIMBY, and historically that has been in these whiter, wealthier neighborhoods of people who are blocking housing, and now you have a universal approach, and how does that impact communities like Crown Heights, like other neighborhoods where it's largely communities of color that are less, have lower incomes. So you have this like standard proposal that strips their voices away. So how does that work? So this is the question. That's the background of the context to the question.
No, I mean, that's a great question. And similar to some other questions we've gotten from commissioners today, this is not intended to obviate the need for rezonings. You know, when people come to you for rezonings, you're talking about significant increases, 50, 100 or percent capacity or more. If anybody wants to do that in the future with a development site that might be zoned manufacturing or might be too low a zoning district for what they want to do, they will still have to come back to this body and to city council and to the community boards for that matter for a rezoning. This is just, you know, a minor set of adjustments across the biggest possible geography to ensure that if and when things develop, you know, that you just get a little bit more on that site. And you multiply that by all the development sites across the city, and we can build a significant amount of new housing, you know, without forcing everybody to go through rezonings like this. But for the most part, community boards, the city planning commission for that matter, city council will retain oversight over zoning map changes and other types of things that really change what can happen on a site. With respect to any site, you know, these changes tend to be pretty modest.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Final word, Commissioner Osorio.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks so much for engaging with all the questions. I realize you've been there for a while, and I appreciate that. These are really quick clarification questions, maybe even yes/no questions. So one is, are there any affordability requirements for the conversion proposals?
The existing conversion proposals and housing opportunity build off the existing framework where there are not affordability requirements. We are ecstatic that the state has created a tax benefit for affordability in conversions. And so for the first time in New York City history, we expect to see affordability in conversions in many locations across the city. And so we're very, very pleased with that.
But we're not requiring them, right?
No, it's building on the existing framework, which doesn't require. In the absence of support from the state, which it looks like we've gotten, our office conversion task force, you know, underscored the fact that affordability mandates are typically they're just not feasible in the context of conversions in the absence of some support. But we got the tax benefit, and so we expect that those will work together to get significant affordability in conversions going forward.
Thank you. The other question is on campus development, given the changes in yard requirements and trees, or basically on yard requirements. Are there any sort of like restrictions to maintain a certain amount of permeable surfaces or trees for that matter?
Right. So campuses will have heightened open space requirements.
Okay.
Relative to, you know, say a cleared development site or smaller sites in order to encourage, you know, infill when it does happen on underutilized spaces as opposed to spaces that people use.
Thank you. And the last question is, I missed it, but I'm wondering, I want to make sure I didn't. Are there any references to carbon neutrality in terms of the ultra low energy designation or any energy efficiency, so like requirements for in the lower density districts?
Not in the zoning. I can't speak to other bodies of law that touch on that, though.
Okay, thanks.
All right, Commissioner, thank you very much. And with that, I am very pleased to say that we will refer City of Yes for Housing Opportunity Community Boards, Borough Boards, and Borough Presidents for 60 days. With much appreciation to you, John, and your team. Thank you all very much for all of your extraordinary efforts to bring us to this day. So this item is now referred. Thank you very much. Congratulations. Okay. Sarah, let's move on to the next item of the day. I mean, this is another biggie, but it's, you know, second place behind quite a biggie today. So let's go on to MSK.
The second item on our agenda is a certification of a zoning map and zoning text amendments, special permits, authorizations, a revocable consent, CPC certification, modification of a previously approved large scale, and a cancellation of a previously approved restricted declaration in Manhattan Community District 8. Our presenter is Aska Mohadin.
Hi, Aska.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Right. So this is a private application by Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, or MSK, to facilitate a 31-story hospital building at 1233 York Avenue in the Lenox Hill neighborhood of Manhattan Community District 8. The applicant is requesting a number of actions, including a zoning map amendment, zoning text amendment, a special permit, an authorization, a revocable consent, a curb cut certification, cancellation of a restricted declaration, and modifications to a large-scale community facility development, site plan, and zoning calculations. This slide provides an aerial view of the surrounding area with north at the top. The development site outlined here in pink is located at 1233 York Avenue, with its frontage along York Avenue between 67th Street and 68th Streets, across the street from Rockefeller University. The built character of the area includes scattered large institutional and mid to high-rise residential buildings to the north, south, and west of the development site. Each of the development site comprises lower-rise institutional uses in a landscape setting along East River. The development site is part of a larger MSK campus located across 3 blocks. The MSK Medical Campus spans 3 city blocks between York Avenue and First Avenue. The North Campus is on the block bound by East 69th Street to the north and 68th Street to the south. It is improved with the church and the Zuckerman Research Center. The main campus comprises the full block bound by East 68th Street to the north and East 67th Street to the south, and provides most of the hospital's diagnostic and treatment functions. The 431-bed Memorial Hospital is located on the eastern portion of the main campus along York Avenue. The South Campus, bound by 67th Street to the north and 66th Street to the south, outlined here in blue, is the project area. It is improved with the Rockefeller Research Lab to the west and the Sloan House and Scholars Residence buildings to the east. The Sloan and Scholars buildings, outlined here in pink, make up the development site where MSK is proposing a new hospital building. The existing MSK campus was facilitated through a mix of as-of-right developments, BSA actions, and CPC actions. This slide shows the area map with north at the top. The proposed development site outlined here in pink is zoned R10 and R8. York Avenue is primarily zoned R10, allowing 10 FAR for residential and community facility development. First Avenue is zoned C19 with a similar FAR allowance of 10. Most of the surrounding mid-blocks are mapped within R9, which allows a residential FAR of 7.52 and community facility of 10 FAR, or R8, which allows a residential FAR up to 7.2 and community facility up to 6.5. The character of the immediate surrounding area is defined by a number of community facility and institutional uses, such as New York Presbyterian, Hospital for Special Surgery, and Cornell University's Medical College, among others. Open space in the area includes the St. Catherine's Park, located 1 block to the west, and the area served by 2nd Avenue, 72nd Street Station, located a few blocks north, providing access to the Q train, and the Lexington Avenue subway stop at East 68th Street, providing access to the 6th train. The hospital is also easily accessible from the FDR. Important for the application before you today are the land use actions granted by the CPC in 2001. At the time, MSK had proposed a number of actions to facilitate the development of the Zuckerman Research Facility on the North Campus and a future new hospital building, as can be seen on the image to the right from the 2001 final environmental impact statement. The 2001 application requested the establishment of the large-scale community facility development, or LFCFD, rezoning for the mid-block of the 3 blocks within the MSK campus from R8 to R9, special permit and authorizations to facilitate the Zuckerman Research Facility. In addition to the Zuckerman building, MSK had plans to utilize the floor area generated from the rezonings to facilitate a hospital building to be designed and developed at a future date. The application was certified, but its public review period was unexpectedly cut short due to the tragic events of 9/11, when the department postponed all hearings. To be responsive to the concerns about the uncertainty of the future hospital building and to ensure the remaining application was able to move forward within the ULURP clock, the chair, in discussion with the applicant, borough president, and city council, decided on a modified application. The applicant withdrew the rezoning application from the South Campus mid-block, and the commission denied without prejudice the authorization to move floor area around the large scale without regard for zoning lot lines. MSK agreed to come back to the commission once the plan for the new hospital building were more concrete. This agreement was further memorialized in a restrictive declaration that restricted the use of the 290,300 square feet floor area generated from the main campus rezoning to require commission approval for any development or enlargement beyond 75,000 square feet. With firm plans for the hospital building now in place, MSK is moving forward with the hospital expansion through this application. This photo shows the development site from York Avenue with the 2 buildings labeled. The development site is improved with the 237-foot Sloan House and the 261-foot tall Scholars Residence. Both the Scholars and Sloan buildings are listed as Use Group 3 community facility uses and provide contract housing for MSK staff with offices on the lower floors. Currently, a 263-space parking garage occupies space beneath both buildings and connects them to the Rockefeller Research Lab behind them. The garage will be retained in the MSK Pavilion, but the 2 buildings will be demolished. The applicant has confirmed that they have found alternate housing within the MSK portfolio for the staff housed in these buildings. The first image on the left shows East 67th Street looking towards York Avenue with Memorial Hospital to the left and Scholars Building to the right. The second image on the right shows the same buildings, but looking west from York Avenue down East 67th Street. The image on the left shows the development site and existing garage entrance from East 66th Street with the Rockefeller Research Lab to the left and Sloan House to the right. The image on the right shows York Avenue from the corner of East 66th Street, looking away from the development site towards York Avenue. The image on the left shows the development site and the larger MSK campus beyond from the corner of York Avenue and East 66th Street. The image on the right is looking north on York Avenue with Memorial Hospital to the left and Rockefeller University across the avenue to the right. The applicant is proposing a 31-story MSK pavilion to be built on the South Campus along York Avenue. The maximum building envelope would have the overall building height limited to 594 feet, and the maximum developable floor area would be 641,580 square feet. The proposed development will connect to the existing Memorial Hospital via a pedestrian bridge. The image on the right is for illustrative purposes only. Let's take a step back to better understand how the application relates to the overall large-scale development. No changes are proposed for the North Campus, and all developable floor area has been utilized on that block. No developments proposed on the main campus, and the remaining floor area from the 2001 approvals, which was restricted through a restrictive declaration, is proposed to be utilized for the development on the South Campus. Finally, moving to the South Campus, no changes are proposed to the Rockefeller Research Lab to the west, which will remain along with the below-grade parking, except a change to the underlying zoning on this portion of the zoning lot. On the east side, the Sloan and Scholars buildings are proposed to be demolished to facilitate the new MSK Pavilion. If the MSK Pavilion is developed as proposed, there will be no remaining developable floor area left within the large-scale development. Zooming into just the main and south campuses now, this site plan drawing shows how the proposed MSK Pavilion will connect with the existing Memorial Hospital through the proposed two-story patient bridge over East 67th Street, which will serve as a primary passage for patients and staff accessing medical services. The MSK Pavilion would provide 28 operating and procedural suites with 206 inpatient beds located on 9 floors. In addition, there will be floor clinical support floors and 5 mechanical floors distributed throughout the building. The MSK Pavilion would have a lobby space along York Avenue, welcoming visitors through entrances on both East 67th Street and East 66th Street. Regular access to the hospital would be through a one-way drive-through with an entrance on East 66th Street going out on East 67th Street. The existing East 66th Street curb cut would continue to be used to access the below-grade 263 accessory garage, but the ramp will be for entrance only, and the garage will be redesigned to improve maneuverability. There will be a total of 4 service berths, including 3 loading docks, 3 on East 67th Street, and 1 on East 66th Street. In total, 7 curb cuts would be provided on the South Campus zoning lot. Along 66th Street, seen along the bottom of the image to the right, there will be a total of 3 curb cuts. 1 existing and reduced 19-foot curb cut serving as the entrance to the existing parking garage, 1 new 16.5-foot curb cut serving as a mandatory ambulance bay, 1 new 18-foot curb cut serving as an entrance to the internal drive-through. There will be 4 curb cuts on East 67th Street. 1 existing curb cut serving the Rockefeller Research Lab building, not shown in this zoomed-in image, and 3 new curb cuts associated with the proposed development. 1 18-foot curb cut existing as the exit to the new internal drive-through, 1 51.5-foot curb cut serving the 3 new service berths, and 1 22-foot curb cut serving as the parking garage's entrance and exit. To facilitate the movement of patients and staff between the existing and proposed hospital buildings, MSK is proposing a 2-story patient bridge over East 67th Street. This slide shows an illustrative rendering of the proposed bridge as it was conceptually approved by the Public Design Commission. The bridge will be designed to allow light to pass through and provide public artwork along the bottom. The proposed bridge will be located approximately 75 feet above curb level. The proposed 24 by 48-foot bridge envelope will be approximately 61 foot long, connecting critical patient floors on the 5th and 6th floors of the MSK Pavilion to the existing 7th and 8th floors of the Memorial Hospital. The surfaces of the 2 bridge floors will slope moderately and appropriately to modulate slightly differing floor-to-floor heights at the connecting floors. In this illustrative rendering of the ground floor along York Avenue, you can see the proposed 2-story lobby along York Avenue stepped back from the streets with a 40-foot building overhang. This is a diagram of the neighborhood character along York Avenue with the proposed 31-story development in pink. The buildings in blue are other MSK buildings within the MSK campus. This is a diagram of the neighborhood character along East 67th Street. The proposed pavilion along York Avenue is shown in pink, and the existing Rockefeller Research Lab behind it in blue. This is the neighborhood character diagram along 66th Street. The applicant is requesting a number of actions to facilitate this development. I will go into detail on each of these actions in the following slides. The first action is a zoning map amendment to rezone the South Campus mid-block from R8 to R9. The R9 zoning allows up to 10 FAR community facility use, which will generate an additional 140,585 square feet for the proposed development on the zoning lot. Second requested action is a zoning text amendment to amend DR 7943 to allow the Commission to permit modifications to lot coverage and signage within a hospital or hospital-related large-scale community facility development located within the boundaries of Community District 8. The applicant is requesting a special permit pursuant to ZR 7943 as amended to permit bulk modifications to enable the large floor plates necessary of hospitals. The first of these modifications relates to the height and setback for the MSK Pavilion's elevations along York Avenue and East 66th Streets, both perimeter streets of the 2001 large-scale to rise without setback and penetrate the required sky exposure plane. Second modification is to the lot coverage to exceed the maximum permitted lot coverage on the South Campus zoning lot. The third modification is the signage to allow for the building information and navigational signs throughout the development. The applicant is also requesting authorization pursuant to ZR 7921 to modify bulk regulations for a development within a large scale. The first modification is to the floor area to allow the distribution of 264,938 square feet of unused floor area on the main block to the south block without regard for zoning lot lines within a large scale. The second modification is to heighten setback to allow the East 67th Street wall, which is fully within the large scale, to rise without the required setbacks and penetrate the required sky exposure planes. Lastly, the authorization would allow the modification of the rear yard regulations to allow a western portion of the MSK Pavilion to be built within a required rear yard equivalent. The applicant is also requesting a modification of the previously authorized large-scale community facility development to reflect the proposed changes to the approved site plan and zoning calculations. The applicant is requesting the cancellation of the restrictive declaration, which placed restrictions on the use of floor area generated as part of the 2001 rezonings until such time as the Commission could further review the plans for proposed hospital building. The applicant is requesting a CPC certification to allow more than one curb cut on a narrow street frontage. The applicant proposes 2 new curb cuts for a total of 3 along the East 66th Street frontage to accommodate the entrance to the one-way northbound internal through-block driveway and a service berth, and 3 new curb cuts for a total of 4 along the East 67th Street frontage to accommodate the internal through-block driveway exit, the new 2-way parking garage ramp, and the 3 new service berths. The last requested action relates to the revocable consent application, also filed with the Department of Transportation. The revocable consent application is reviewed by the Commission when it has been determined to have land use impact, such as in this case with a bridge constructed over a street. This application requires a racial equity report, which helps put the proposal into context with the neighborhood level socioeconomic data. There is no housing proposed as part of this application. The displacement risk index estimates comparative levels of residential displacement risk for New York City's neighborhoods. The index ranks neighborhoods from lowest to highest risk based on recent population characteristics, housing conditions, and market pressures. On this index, Lenox Hill, Roosevelt Island falls in the lowest displacement risk category. The population of the Upper East Side is 74% white non-Hispanic, 11% Asian, 8% Hispanic Latino, and 3% Black non-Hispanic. From 2010 to 2020, the area saw a 6% increase in population with an increase in the Asian and Hispanic populations, a decrease in the Black population, and a small decrease in the white population. While the population grew by 6% from 2010 to 2020, the number of housing units in the Upper East Side increased by only 1%. The housing production in the Upper East Side lagged behind Manhattan overall and the New York City overall, which both showed an increase in housing units of 7 to 8%. A notice of completion of a draft environmental impact statement was issued on April 26, 2024. The DEIS identified significant adverse impacts with respect to shadows, construction, transportation, traffic, construction noise. Mitigation measures are identified in the DEIS and will be explored further in the final EIS. In summary, the applicant is seeking a number of actions to facilitate a 31-story hospital building in the Lenox Hill neighborhood of Manhattan Community District 8. The proposed building would have a maximum height of 594 feet and a floor area of 641,580 square feet. The proposal also includes a patient bridge connecting the building with Memorial Hospital over East 67th Street. Thank you, and happy to take any questions.
Great, thanks, Asuka. I just have a couple technical small ones. On the special permit to exceed lot coverage, what is the current limit and what are they seeking?
That's a great question. So the way that the lot coverage, wrong. Right, so the way that the lot coverage is measured is through sort of different lot types. So there are 2 corner lots within the zoning lot and then 2 through lots. So on the corner lots, which are along the York Avenue, lot coverage that's permitted is 75%, where they're proposing 100%. And then the through lot, 100%. And then on the through lots that are, they're part of the through lot includes the new development, but most of it is the Rockefeller Research Lab. There, it's permitted is 65%, and they're proposing 70%.
Okay, great. And similarly, on the authorization for the rear yard, to allow the western portion of the pavilion to be built within the required rear yard equivalent. It's really the same question. What is the current rule and what is the relief sought?
Yeah, so the current rule is 30 feet rear yard. So this is, again, it's the through lot and the corner lot, similar thing. So it's a 30-foot rear yard on the corner lots, 100 feet from the street. And you can see sort of in this that most of the rear yard equivalent is existing through the Rockefeller Research Lab, but there's a portion that is within the proposed pavilion. I can't point to it, but.
A portion of the rear yard that is in the new proposed building?
Yes. So the portion that's the newly generated, rear yard variance that's required here.
Okay. All right. I got it. Thank you. Let me go to Commissioner Cremani.
Thank you, and thanks for the presentation. Still a quick question that's probably more for the applicant. But in on slide 7, where we see the development site with the 2 buildings, which are both residences and offices, those are very big. Do they have more detail on where they're going to put people?
We can ask them to provide further details. As far as what they've told us is that they were able to find alternate housing.
Yeah, we'd love to know how that's working out. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Asuka. This item is certified. Thank you.
The third item on our agenda is a non-ULURP modification of a previously approved restricted declaration in Manhattan Community District 2. Presenting for the first time to the Commission is Chelsea Evans.
All right, Chelsea, welcome.
Hi, good afternoon, Commissioners. Okay. This is an application at 570 Washington Street for a CPC modification to the restrictive declaration. The applicant, ACI VI Clarkson LLC, is requesting to modify the required residential unit size mix in the Senior Affordable Building at 570 Washington Street in Hudson Square, Manhattan Community District 2. The development site, outlined in yellow, occupies an entire block bounded by West Houston, West Clarkson, and Washington Streets. The development site is a part of a larger zoning lot, outlined in blue, that also includes the 550 Washington Street property, located to the south of West Houston Street, known as St. John's Terminal. The development site will contain 2 buildings, a market rate residential building addressed as 80 Clarkson Street, and a senior affordable building. The senior affordable building is the subject of this application, and it is currently under construction and is anticipated to be completed in December 2026. 570 Washington Street was subject to a series of land use actions that were approved by the City Planning Commission in 2016 to facilitate a proposed mixed-use development at 550 Washington Street, 80 Clarkson Street, and 570 Washington Street. The special permit, pursuant to Section 8921 of the zoning resolution, allowed for a transfer of 200,000 square feet of development rights from Hudson River Park to the zoning lot. Additionally, the special permit modified height and setback requirements, height factor requirements, and rear yard requirements to facilitate the proposed massing of the mixed-use development. The provision of affordable housing was a condition of the special permit pursuant to ZR 8921. And although not required by the special permit, as a result of discussions between the applicant and various stakeholders, the affordable housing building was set aside for seniors only. The unit size mix in this building is memorialized in the restrictive declaration. Here you can see a table that outlines the existing requirements of the restrictive declaration, as well as the proposed modification, which is highlighted in red. Currently, the RD requires that at least 75% of the units in the senior affordable building be one-bedrooms, and the remainder may be studios. The New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development, or HPD, has requested that the senior affordable building include two-bedroom units to encourage a greater diversity of household types and sizes, such as seniors living with adult children or grandchildren. To maintain the same number of overall units, the applicant has proposed to modify the restrictive declaration to require that a minimum of 20% of the units be two bedrooms, a minimum of 30% of the units be one bedrooms, and studios may occupy a maximum of 50% of the total residential units in the building. In line with this modification, the applicant has proposed the following unit size mix: 37 two-bedroom units, which is approximately 21% of the units, 56 one-bedroom units, which is approximately 32% of the units, and 83 studio units, approximately 47% of the units. This unit size mix will allow for the project to provide the planned 176 units overall. And in addition, the senior affordable housing would continue to contain floor area equal to 25% of the residential floor area on the development site, as required by the approvals in the inclusionary housing program. All other elements of the approved design and requirements for the project would remain unchanged. The action necessary to facilitate this modification is a CPC modification pursuant to the terms of the restrictive declaration. The declaration reads that the declaration may be modified upon application by the declarant and with the express written approval of the Commission. Because this is a CPC modification that does not require Community Board or City Council review, you are being asked to vote on this at today's review session. Thank you, and happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you. All right, let me see if there are any questions on this one. No questions, okay. Great, well, the next step here would be a vote. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to move directly into a vote. Just want to make sure there are no questions. Okay. Seeing none, I'll seek assent by a voice vote to send an approval letter to the Buildings Department. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. Okay, thank you. Motion is approved. Congratulations. Thank you. All right, Sarah.
The fourth item on our agenda is a pre-hearing review of a special permit, zoning text amendments, landfill, city map amendment, and authorizations in Staten Island Community District 3. Presenting for the first time to the Commission is Andrew Jones.
All right, Andrew, welcome.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Andrew Jones. I'm a Senior Planning Team Leader in the Staten Island office. I'm here to once again present Arthur Kill Terminal, a proposed marine port for offshore wind turbine staging and assembly in the Richmond Valley neighborhood in the Staten Island Community District 3. This is a private application submitted by Arthur Kill Terminal LLC requesting the following land use actions: a zoning text amendment that would add sustainability-related goals to Staten Island's Special South Richmond District, as well as a set of new findings pertaining to waterfront lots in manufacturing districts. 2 zoning authorizations specific to the South Richmond District, 1 to modify natural features on a zoning lot greater than 1 acre, and another to construct a group parking facility. A zoning special permit also specific to the South Richmond District to build structures of more than 50 feet in height, a landfill action to create an approximately 1,300-foot linear quay along the Arthur Kill, and a city map action to demap the unbuilt portion of Richmond Valley Road that lies to the west of Arthur Kill Road. Again, these actions, if approved, will facilitate the development of a 50-acre state-of-the-art marine port for the assembly, staging, and pre-commissioning of wind turbine generators and other components. The site plan shown here depicts the 9 key programmatic elements of the proposed development, each of which I will briefly describe now. The 18-acre dredge basin that would allow vessels to safely access the inbound and outbound berths at the facility. The inbound quay, where offshore wind components and other materials would be unloaded. The inbound storage area, where initial assembly work would begin. The pre-assembly area, where tower sections would be stood up vertically. The outbound quay, where these partially assembled towers would be prepared for load out onto vessels bound for offshore wind farms. The pad that would enable jack-up vessels or rigs specifically designed for deep sea construction to be elevated, facilitating easier loading for these partially assembled towers. A 23-acre main storage area where tower sections and other turbine components would be stacked horizontally. An approximately 22,000 square foot warehouse and office building that would be used for the storage of tools, spare parts, consumables, as well as tenants' administrative activities, which would be serviced by an approximately 111 space parking area. A rehabilitated historic home known as the Coal House and the surrounding landscaped area, which would be retained by the owner applicant for use as an education and visitor center and would be serviced by an additional 13 parking spaces. Once again, here are the requested land use actions that would facilitate the proposed project. Text amendments to sections 107-00 and 107-65 of the zoning resolution, which would add a new goal to the general purposes section of the Special South Richmond District to, quote, promote water-dependent uses that provide a substantial environmental benefit. Secondly, it would create a new pathway that would enable South Richmond District manufacturing zone sites that are greater than an acre in size and contain such an environmentally beneficial water-dependent use to forego the requirement of establishing an area of no disturbance. Second, a zoning authorization pursuant to the modified 107-65. This would enable the applicant to remove approximately 1,200 trees and modify the site's topography by up to 18 feet, which would facilitate the creation of the unenclosed areas that are necessary for the site's operations. Another zoning authorization pursuant to zoning resolution section 107-68, which would allow for the creation of 124 parking spaces, again, 111 of which would be located near the warehouse and office building, and another 13 at the Coal House. A special permit pursuant to ZR section 107-73 that would allow for structures of more than 50 feet in height. This would facilitate the installation of light poles with a maximum height of approximately 150 feet, which are necessary to facilitate 24-hour operations on the site. A landfill action to add approximately 1.17 million cubic feet of fill and create an approximately 1,300-foot linear quay along Arthur Kill, which is measured from the site's high water line to the U.S. bulkhead line. Lastly, a separate but related application has also been filed to modify the city map, which would eliminate, discontinue, and close an unbuilt portion of Richmond Valley Road that lies to the west of Arthur Kill Road. This demapping will facilitate the disposition of land within the currently mapped roadway so that it may be incorporated into the project site. A draft environmental impact statement was completed on February 2nd. This document identified potentially significant adverse impacts in 3 categories: historical and cultural resources, natural resources, and noise. Mitigation measures for these impacts will be further fleshed out in the final environmental impact statement, which will be published 10 days prior to the Commission's vote. The project was also determined to be consistent with all relevant waterfront revitalization program policies. This application was certified on February 5th and was duly referred to Staten Island Community Board 3 and the Staten Island Borough President. Community Board 3 held a public hearing and voted to unanimously approve the application with conditions on March 26th. The Community Board's one condition was to request that the applicant work with a local environmental advocate, the protectors of Pine Oak Woods, to identify appropriate sites for mitigation on Staten Island. The Staten Island Borough President's Office submitted the recommendation, which was also to approve the application with conditions on April 25th. The Borough President's first condition broadly echoed that of the Community Board, which was a request for the applicant to work with the protectors of Pine Oak Woods and another organization, the Staten Island Coalition for Wetlands and Forests, to identify mitigation sites on Staten Island. Their second condition included a series of proposed changes to the regulations governing battery energy storage systems, or BESS, on Staten Island. However, these proposed changes are not related to the application before the Commission today, as they are beyond the scope of the applicant's proposed text amendments to ZR Section 107-00 and 107-65. I would like to close this presentation by following up on some of the key questions and concerns that have been raised by both the Commission and the other entities involved in the public review process to date. I should note that much of the information shown in the following slides has been provided by the applicant team, who can speak more to these items when they present to the Commission on Wednesday. First and foremost, concerns around wetland impacts and mitigation approaches were prominent. Between the dredge and fill, approximately 28 acres of wetlands are expected to be impacted by the proposed project. The applicant is in the process of preparing a mitigation plan under the auspices of several cities, state, and federal agencies that seeks to offset these impacts commensurately. However, the details of this mitigation plan will not be finalized until the project completes the requisite federal permitting processes. The draft EIS also identified potential adverse impacts to archaeological resources. As a result, questions were raised regarding what remains may be on the site and what mitigation measures are under consideration. The applicant has shared that the project has an archaeological plan that has been reviewed and signed off on by both the Landmark Preservation Commission and the State Historic Preservation Commission. The plan found that it cannot be determined whether certain deposits that have been found on the site to date are archaeological resources until portions of the site have been cleared and further assessed. The applicant plans to work with these agencies as the site work proceeds to figure out how best to preserve any archaeological resources that may be discovered. Given the complex nature of the offshore wind industry, questions were also raised around Arthur Kill Terminal's ownership and operations, specifically regarding how Arthur Kill would be regulated. The applicant has shared that the ongoing operations and maintenance of the port would be subject to the jurisdiction of 7 agencies across different levels of government, including the New York City Departments of City Planning and Environmental Protection, the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, the Federal Department of Transportation's Maritime Administration, the Army Corps of Engineers, the Coast Guard, and the Customs and Border Patrol. The site would primarily be operated by the port's tenants, that is, offshore wind companies, but the owner applicant would retain a permanent on-site staff presence, primarily for the purposes of providing oversight. Moreover, the draft EIS found that there would be no significant adverse traffic impacts associated with the port's anticipated operations. Additionally, the review session raised several points of discussion related to employment and workforce development on the site. The applicant has shared that all job opportunities associated with Arthur Kill Terminal would be filled according to a project labor agreement, which is effectively a pre-hire collective bargaining agreement between labor unions and a developer or operator of a given project. 2 such agreements would govern all hiring practices associated with Arthur Kill Terminal, one with the New York City Building and Construction Trades Council for the approximately 600 construction jobs that the project would create, and another that is part of the NYSERDA contract that any prospective tenant for Arthur Kill Terminal would have had to agree to in order to receive state funding for their wind energy project. Additionally, the applicant has shared that they have been working with several local workforce development entities, including schools, nonprofits, and the like, to help ensure that there are local workers who are prepared to fill any jobs by the Arthur Kill Terminal. As noted previously, the proposed visitor center is intended to serve as a venue for education, engagement, and other community programming around opportunities in the offshore wind industry. Significant volume of fill required to construct the quay raised questions around where this material would come from and how it would get to the site. The applicant has shared that most of the fill is expected to consist of materials recovered from the project site, including dredge spoils, reused riprap, stone, and concrete. A final layer of compacted stone would be brought in to complete the site's grading. Most of this limited amount of externally sourced fill would be brought in via barge. However, a small subset of materials would be brought in via truck from a nearby supplier who is located less than 5 miles from the project site. Additionally, there was a question around the construction of the quay could also affect the hydrology of adjacent sites. The applicant has shared that retaining walls would be installed between Arthur Kill Terminal and the neighboring lots, which would help account for the difference in elevation and limit tidal influence. Lastly, the dredging of this portion of Arthur Kill would slow currents and any other sort of water mass movement along the nearby shoreline. This concludes my presentation. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any additional questions the Commission may have at this time.
Terrific. Thank you very much. We have questions from Commissioner Osorio.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks so much for the report. It's very thorough. I have a couple of questions I'll save for Wednesday. Sure. But just to clarify 2 quick things. One is I remember that one of the questions and discussion points at the review session was, when we certified this, was regarding a inconsistency in the number of trees that were that will be lost. I'm wondering if you can clarify how many?
Sure, let me get back to that slide. So it's 1,204 trees. Oh, sorry.
Gotcha. Okay, 1,000. Okay, perfect. And then the other question has to do with, I remember that there was some back and forth in terms of what happens if we rezone, we allow, but the deal sort of like doesn't go through. These actions are connected to, like, there's a site plan that requires that this is used for offshore wind?
Thank you for the question. There is no requirement that the site is used for offshore wind in the future, but the text amendment to the Special South Richmond District requires that in order for the site to be altered to the extent that the applicant is proposing to, it has to be used for an environmentally beneficial water-dependent use.
But that could mean many things, no?
Correct.
Right, that's Katie Ferrara-Anito, Director of the Staten Island office. And just to clarify, that's the premise of the text amendment, is that it would allow for environmentally beneficial use. The fact that they are seeking the 10765 authorization also means we're intending to lock in the site plan. So it would be utilized for, as shown in the details of an offshore wind operator, unless they were to come back for modifications.
Gotcha. Thank you. And I'll ask this on Wednesday, but I'm wondering if you know of what has been the response to the community board's recommendations?
I mean, there's a broad understanding of the value of this project. I think it was, it was a pretty clear conversation that the applicant had at the community board session that evening. They clarified some of the environmental impact questions that I think also came up at review session. There's not been kind of a broader discussion of that beyond any further conversations, kind of maybe outside of the public, that the applicant will be able to speak to on Wednesday.
Fair enough. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Commissioner Cerullo?
Just really not so much, unless you have information on this, but just for the record, and it's something I will ask the applicant on Wednesday, but there's been a lot of news reports recently about the state and its support of facilities such as this and delays in proceeding on projects like this. And I just wonder, there's a comfort, obviously, in the fact that the site plan will be locked in, and that if any changes were to take place, they'd have to come back to us. Clearly, someone would have to come back to us. But I just wonder if we already sense a concern or what the relationship may be with what is happening beyond this application and this application. And has that conversation taken place with the applicant and the department in any way up until this point?
Thank you, Commissioner. The applicant is aware of some of the, supply chain and other issues affecting the offshore wind industry. They've shared with us that New York State is, committed to delivering 9,000 megawatts of energy generated by offshore wind power by 2035, and that those commitments last, regardless of some of the initial struggles that the industry is dealing with. And they're encouraged by some of the measures that NYSERDA has taken to promptly, rebid some of the contracts that did experience some of these issues. But yeah, the applicant can speak more to some of the conversations there on Wednesday. Thank you again.
Great.
Thank you.
Back to Commissioner Osorio.
Thank you, Chair. One other quick question. So just what is your understanding of timelines here in terms of when the state will be done with the mitigation plan for the wetland? Will that happen before more or less, when do you expect that? Before we vote, when do you expect that to happen, basically?
Thank you, Commissioner. The applicant can speak to the timeline for any other permitting processes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay, with that, we'll pick this one up on Wednesday. Congratulations again. Nice job. Okay, Sarah.
Okay, future votes. Future votes for consideration for Wednesday, May 1st, 2024. Staff have prepared reports for a landmark designation for New York Public Library Tremont Branch, DCAS disposition site CD 11, and Times Square Major Concession. Also, staff have prepared reports on Red Hook coastal resiliency. There was a follow-up memo from the applicants in your weekend materials. Emily Bachman is here on Zoom to present a recommendation.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Okay, this is a post-hearing follow-up and staff recommendation for the city application for changes to the city map and acquisitions to facilitate the Red Hook Coastal Resiliency Project in Red Hook, Brooklyn, Community District 6. This application was certified on December 11th of last year. The public hearing took place on Wednesday, April 3rd. Post-hearing review took place on April 15th, and the vote is scheduled for this Wednesday, May 1st. The applicant has provided written updates in response to questions raised during the public hearing and post-hearing review regarding the proposed flood protection alignment and design flood elevation, as well as additional measures to further address flood risk in Red Hook. Next slide. The department supports this application for changes to the city map and acquisitions, which would facilitate the construction, operation, and maintenance of the Red Hook Coastal Resiliency Project to provide neighborhood level coastal flood protection through a system of flood walls, raised street grades, and deployable floodgates, while preserving access to the waterfront and expanding the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway. The department recognizes the urgent need for coastal flood protection in response to climate change projections for rising sea levels and increased frequency and intensity of coastal storms made evident by the devastation of Hurricane Sandy in 2012, and finds this application to be consistent with the city's comprehensive waterfront plan, which lays out goals and strategies for promoting climate resiliency and adaptation, including using climate risk information in public policies and investments, managing risks from flooding with coastal protection systems, and promoting the design of climate resilient buildings and infrastructure. The department believes that the proposed project is a significant step forward in protecting Red Hook's businesses, employees, and approximately 11,000 residents from coastal flood risk, including more than 6,000 NYCHA residents living in Red Hook houses. Red Hook's low-lying topography makes it particularly vulnerable to coastal flooding, and the prevalence of maritime industrial land uses and private ownership of shoreline lots are critical considerations for designing a flood protection project in Red Hook. These factors, informed by years of public engagement and technical analysis, necessitate the proposed actions before the commission. Changes to the city map will maximize use of the public right-of-way by integrating the flood protection system into the street network, and acquisitions on adjacent private properties will allow the city to seek easements for operation and maintenance of the proposed flood protection system. The department recognizes that the proposed project will not remove all current and future flood risk in Red Hook, but it will complement other resiliency measures, including NYCHA's Red Hook Houses resiliency upgrades, DEP's Columbia Street Water and Sewer Project, Parks Red Hook Recreation Area environmental remediation, and citywide requirements for flood resilient building standards in Appendix G of the Building Code, and flexibility created by zoning for coastal flood resiliency to meet or exceed those standards. Citywide, we also have DEP's Right to Know program for proper storage of chemicals in the floodplain, SBS grants for business preparedness and resiliency, and MOCEJ's climate resiliency design guidelines will help ensure that buildings, landscapes, and infrastructure are designed to withstand climate threats now and in the future. In summary, the department recognizes that a variety of capital projects, programs, and policies are needed to reduce Red Hook's vulnerability to climate hazards. The proposed actions before you would facilitate the construction of a flood protection system that significantly advances that necessary work by reducing Red Hook's coastal flood risk while maintaining waterfront access and neighborhood connectivity. That concludes my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions.
Chair Osorio.
Thank you, Chair. I read the report, and I very much appreciate the language that was included there to reflect the different concerns that have been raised, as well as in your presentation. Thank you very much. I have a couple follow-ups, but I will do that in writing. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Any other questions? Okay, great. Thanks very much, Emily.
Thank you. For post-hearing follow-ups, we have 2724 College Point Boulevard Commercial Overlay, which had a public hearing at the April 17th public meeting. Joy Chin is on Zoom to present a recommendation.
All right, Joy.
Hi, good afternoon, Chair and Commissioners. The department City planning staff supports the applicant's proposal to amend the zoning map to establish a C23 commercial overlay in an existing zoning district split between an R4 and R5B zoning districts located at the intersection of College Point Boulevard and 28th Avenue in Flushing, Queens. The applicant-owned development site is currently vacant and unimproved, and the applicant proposes to develop a single-story eating and drinking establishment. The C23 commercial overlay also would bring existing non-conforming commercial uses in the project area, which have been operating since the 1930s, into conformance and reinforce the commercial light industrial character of College Point Boulevard. A CPC report reflecting this recommendation has been prepared for the commission. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Okay, great. What's next? Thank you, Joy.
Next, we have 5875 Queens Midtown Expressway rezoning, which had a public hearing at the April 17th public meeting. Catherine Crawford is on Zoom to present a recommendation.
Good afternoon. The Department of City Planning staff supports the applicant's request to amend the zoning map to change from an M11 zoning district to an M14 district. The proposed expansion of the existing warehouse building meets the city's goal to generate new employment opportunities in industrial and manufacturing sectors. The project area is located in Masbeth Industrial Business Zone and is close to a major highway with local bus access, making it easily accessible for employees. A CPC report reflecting this recommendation has been prepared for the commission. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Catherine.
Okay. Lastly, for post-hearing follow-ups, we have 2118 Avenue U, which had a public hearing at the April 17th public meeting. Catherine is here to present a recommendation.
Good afternoon, Chair Gronick and Commissioners. This is a post-hearing review and staff recommendation for the 2118 Avenue U rezoning in the Madison neighborhood of Brooklyn Community District 15. Next slide, please. The department supports this application, which will facilitate the creation of 10 units of housing, 3 income restricted, where the existing zoning does not reflect the current built landscape and potential for growth. The zoning map amendment would map a new R6A zoning district, which would allow for a maximum FAR of 3.6 with mandatory inclusionary housing, or MAH, while the new C24 commercial overlay allows for a maximum commercial FAR of 2.0. The zoning text amendment would map MAH options 1 and 2 coterminous with the new R6A C24 district. The applicant has indicated they intend to pursue MAH option 1, with incomes averaging to 60% AMI for the income restricted units. The department supports allowing new housing, including units permanently income restricted, along a vibrant, transit-accessible neighborhood retail corridor. Currently, there are no inclusionary housing areas within a half-mile of the project area. Moreover, from 2014 to 2022, only 14 income-restricted units at or below 120% AMI were constructed and completed within Brooklyn Community District 15. The department also notes that the R6A zoning envelope is appropriate given the 80-foot width of Avenue U, and that the proposed R6A district will bring an existing non-complying first-story apartment building closer to compliance. As such, the department recommends approval of the 2118 Avenue U rezoning. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that. All right, looks like we are pretty much at the end of our agenda. With appreciation to all of you commissioners for your time and attention today. Certainly the Department of City Planning for lots of hard work which went into today. We'll look forward to seeing you all Wednesday at 10 o'clock, and we are adjourned. Thank you.
The time is 4:21 p.m.